This is a PowerPoint about Bleed from the game Limbus Company. So this video is going to be divided into 5 different sections. We'll be first talking about Bleed and its mechanical aspects, how it works in the first place. We'll be then talking about, well, the identities that inflict Bleed in the first place. Mostly meta-relevant IDs that are currently used in most players that have access to most of the content in the game. Those players, what they prefer to use. We will not be talking about like budget teams. Oh, technically this ID is going to be good for early game, blah, 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 blah. Those are not going to be counted here. We're talking about the maximum potential that a Bleed team can commit and what identities allow for that in first place. We'll be then talking about egos that come alongside them, accompanying them with vastly varying effects, some being extremely relevant to Bleed, making Bleed as a status extremely good, and some other egos that are not as important but still give a little bonus to the Bleed team overall, or maybe just to its identities personally. We'll be then talking about my personal teams, my personal preferences for varying different types of bosses, and identities that I think are deserving of a spot in a Bleed team. And I'll be talking shortly about why I prefer using these identities over some others. We'll be then finishing off the video with my own personal thoughts of Bleed as a whole in general. Onwards. Chapter 1. An overview of Bleed. So, the status of Bleed, like most other statuses in the game, have a effect. And the effect for Bleed specifically is the following. When tossing an attack coin, take fixed damage by the effect's potency, then reduce its count by 1, with a maximum value of 9 in potency and count. And I understand that some people wouldn't really understand that just from a glimpse of it. So I'll be showing some visual demonstrations. Here we have a Gregor with a 5 potency and 10 bleed count. We see Gregor use an attack skill, which has an attack coin. Here we see Gregor use 1 coin, which makes him take 5 damage. We see earlier, where he had 5-10 bleed, he now has 5-9. Why is that the case? Because he tossed an attack coin, and he took fixed damage by the effect's potency, which was 5, then he reduced the count by 1, so it became 9. It is important to note that it is fixed damage, not any kind of sin damage, like sinking, where sinking would inflict actually bloom damage. It is more so akin to rupture, which deals true damage, meaning the damage that the enemy takes is not accounted in protection, defense level, and other multipliers like that. It is purely a fixed damage. And we took 5 bleed damage total, because we only tossed 1 attack skill, and because we only took 1 attack skill, he only took 5 damage. Here, bleed doesn't only actually happen on just attacks, it also happens in clashes. If you ever played Bleed, you would notice this. And here we have a clash between Gregor and an unknown man we took from the homeless street. Here we see Gregor toss an attack coin at the defenseless K-Corp citizen, where he breaks 1 coin. Now, this clash, you need to win 3 coins. As in, if Gregor wants to win the clash, he would have to kill 3 coins. This is an example similar to the previous one, where he just tossed an attack coin, and he just took 5 damage. We see Gregor charging up another attack. We notice now that there's only 2 coins on the enemy side, so the clash is still going on. This repeats again, with Gregor taking 5 damage once again. Now the bleed stack is at 5-8, because we triggered it 2 times, and every trigger, we reduce its count by 1. You can notice here how we are tossing two coins on every single clash, but we're not really proccing it 2 times. That's because bleed counts it like this. This 1 clash right here, that's just 1 activation. Even though there's 2 coins, you're only tossing it 1 time, as in tossing each of these coins 1 time. So it only counts for 1 proc. And this happens once again. And here Gregor takes the finishing blow, about to break the final coin of this defenseless citizen from K-Corp. But suddenly, Gregor loses the clash due to unknown reasons. Gregor just took another instance of damage, even though he didn't win the clash. So we see here that bleed damage can also happen if you lose a clash, because you still toss a coin, so you're still technically attacking. You still toss an attack coin, which is why he just took 5 damage here right now. And we'll see if Gregor wins this next clash. It looks like he prevails, and Gregor actually loses this clash. He loses the clash once again, getting to 5-6. He has just broken 2 attack coins from this defenseless K-Corp citizen. And he just lost 2 attack coins from this defensive K-Corp citizen. So here we saw 4 clashes. And 4 clashes counted proccing each by each 1 time, 1 time, 1 time, 1 time, until we got to 5-6. Because we activated 4 times. And because we activated bleed 4 times, we therefore reduced its count by 4 times. Which is why we're at 5-6 now. And now we just took 20 bleed damage total. And it seems like Gregor has unfortunately lost the clash because he is a bum-ass outcast. And he just took 20 bleed damage total. 20 fixed damage really isn't that little when you're talking about identities at the very least. So you can see how bleed as a status really racks up in damage through your coin amounts. And this is going to be really important when we talk about the different intricacies that you have while doing bleed and how you're going to maintain this in the first place. We saw earlier how the count was being reduced, but in this example, count was plentiful enough so it dealt its max potential damage. But we'll see that isn't exactly the easiest to do, especially in 0 SP fights. And it looks like our K-Corp citizen decided to give a little gift. So, just to sum things up, mechanically, in a clash, bleed damage is equal to the amount of coin breaks you needed to do to win that clash. We saw earlier that Gregor needed to do 3 coin breaks, but he failed. He only broke 2, and Gregor himself only had 2 coins. So Heathcliff, to win that clash, he needed to win two clashes. And those 4 clashes, in total, are the bleed damage you took. In an unopposed attack, or just regular attack after a clash, bleed damage is equal to the amount of coins you used to attack. We'll be seeing how that works very shortly. We see here another example of a clash. Here you notice how the bleed actually increased. Why is that the case? The skill that we're looking at has the following. If this unit failed to consume Blood Feast, which we'll be getting into later, but let's just assume it is inactive currently, gain 5 bleed. So they just gained 5 bleed. And because they gained 5 bleed, they went to 6-4 bleed count and potency. And here, they just broke a single coin. So they just broke a single coin, which procs bleed 1 time. Which means they just took 6 bleed damage, and now the count is reduced by 1. But there's still a couple of clashes left. So the clash continues. We break another one, taking 6 damage once again and reducing count by 1. And here, it doesn't stop there. Now there's no clashing, no coins at all to clash anymore. So now the skill actually has to damage them. So here we see how the skill actually damages them. It tosses 1 coin, taking 6 bleed damage once again, and tosses again another coin. Now you notice here that the bleed stack actually ran out. Once you hit 0, your potency also hits 0, and therefore your status is just gone from the enemy entirely. So now we only do 1 attack, which takes 0 bleed damage. We saw earlier how 2 clash coin breaks, which was breaking 2 of the enemy's 2 coins, and 2 unopposed coins actually dealt 24 damage because it procced 4 times. We saw earlier how there was 3 unopposed attacks. And these 3 unopposed attacks, they would proc bleed 3 times. But because bleed couldn't proc in this last one because it ran out, we only had 2 coins that actually proc bleed damage. Therefore, 6 times 4, 4 being the count, and 6 being the potency, 4 being usually the amount of coin breaks, but its max cap is your bleed count itself. It cannot go over that. We could not say 6 times 5 because we only had 4 potency in the first place. So it was impossible to do 6 times 5 damage in the first place, which would have been 30. That is, I hope, the full explanation of bleed mechanically, quite simple. But we're kind of missing something here. Something essential to a status. How are you going to inflict them in the first place? We just talked about its mechanical aspects, how it works, how it activates, but what even activates them in the first place? Well, we'll be looking at, very shortly, another status. Sinking. Identities. An integral part of Limbus Company. The characters you view in your little battles, they do their little skills, and most importantly to this video, they activate their own very own status effects. Chapter 2. Bleed Identities. But before we even get into Bleed Identities, I do have a certain faction and status that I want to talk about first. And that is going to be the Blood Fiends and their unique mechanic, Blood Feast. Now, if you're not familiar with Blood Feast, I'll just sum it up for you. You know how earlier Priest Gregor took 20 bleed damage? That 20 bleed damage is going to be stored in this status. If you have a Blood Fiend on your team, it's going to be stored in a certain status, in this status, the Blood Feast status, as like a sort of bank. And the number of bleed damage you took is going to be stored in it. So earlier, Gregor took 20 bleed damage. That 20 bleed damage is going to be stored into this. So you have 20 Blood Feast now. This Blood Feast is going to be consumed by a variety of different skills and identities for varying bonuses. Some worse than others, but we'll get there when we get there. And the Blood Fiends, an extremely integral part of Bleed. I'd say, although a lot of people would say, oh, the introduction of a certain identity that was released a little before the Blood Fiends was the major pushing point for Bleed, I'd actually argue that after Canto 7 was fully released, and including the seasonal identity, I'd actually say the Blood Fiends are the most major update to Bleed we've ever seen. It revamped the Bleed archetype, it changed the playstyle, and it actually, in my opinion, made it viable. Although just running that one identity that was released earlier was okay, and it was actually strong because, you know, he was the strongest identity in the game, well, Blood Fiends just made it so much more consistent, and we'll see how that is right now. The first of the Blood Fiends, Priest Gregor, I do want to point out his stats in the first place. An impressive 296 HP, a stat that you would only usually see in mere Salt identities, and he has a 46 speed range and 60 defense level with 80% stagger threshold. These stats are extremely reminiscent of Pequod Harpooner Heathcliff, an identity that was released way back in Season 5, not really relevant, but he has extremely similar stats to Priest Gregor, and he has a similar playstyle, which is he has a very high stagger threshold, and there was a lot of strategies circulating at the time. You see, like, oh, the Canto 5 boss, you want to get staggered early, and then he won't get staggered again. There's a lot of benefits to getting staggered early, although that sounds bad. Getting staggered early was actually a viable strategy, because for these identities specifically, because they only have one stagger threshold, once you get staggered early, well, you're not going to have a lot of threat in attacks, because it's still the early turns. Early cycles are not going to have very high damaging attacks. And if you get staggered early, you're never going to get staggered again. But we'll see how that is so much stronger with Priest Gregor compared to Pequod Heathcliff, which barely had anything to do other than just, oh, big chunk of HP. We'll see how that is so much stronger on Priest Gregor. And to point that out, I will say, and I will mention, Ailing Heart. Ailing Heart, which I feel like is an underrated part of Priest Gregor's kit, is a status you get at the beginning of the turn when you play him. The first turn, immediately when you deploy him, he's going to have this status. Ailing Heart status, which you gain one stack every single end of a turn. So at turn 1 you're going to have 1 stack, at turn 2 you're going to have 2 stacks, etc, etc, etc. And it gives defense level based on every 3 stack instance, to a max of 6 defense level at 9 Ailing Heart, and 6 defense level is obtained if you're at 50% or less HP Unconditionally, it's going to give you 3 defense level, and at below 40% and less HP, he heals based on his damage. He heals. And we'll see how much his enemy actually heals, other than just Ailing Heart. Why am I making healing look like such a big deal? Because he only has 1 stagger threshold. If you're healing with only 1 stagger threshold, that means you're going to be active every single turn and you're recovering health on top of that, on top of all this defense level. Quick Healer could never do this. He didn't have healing. You would need to have run Fluid Stack, Foss to do this. You need to have an external source of healing. But Priestcracker heals on base kit. Healing on base kit with high defense level, how much health do you think he's gonna tank? That is insane, especially on Identity with such high defense level and health as this one. So already seeing here, we're seeing the archetypical tank of the Bleed team. He is the tank of the Blood Fiends. He is the tank of the Bleed team. And I will mention how, in other ways, how much he supports the Bleed team in a lot of other ways. Well, I want to mention his passive first, just to get it out of the way. He heals SP based on 5+ own. We'll see how fast you can actually help fulfill this lusting, lust affinity. He heals SP based on Ailing Heart. He heals less based on how much Ailing Heart he has. So if he has 3 Ailing Heart, he's going to heal 7 SP on turn 9 instead. I want to point out that he heals based on the least SP, not a random ally, and that's pretty important because that means a lot of your team is going to be consistent. Now, how do you support the Bleed team in other ways other than just being a huge meat shield? Well, he gains self-bleed. I mentioned earlier how when you take bleed damage, whether it be from, by the way, just an important thing I want to point out, whether it be from yourself or from an enemy, that bleed damage is going to be stored into Blood Feast. Well, Priestcracker takes self-bleed damage. Self-bleed damage on 25 on his skill 1, 10 on his skill 2, and 10 on his skill 3. So you notice this identity actually consumes a lot of his own health just to give you Blood Feast. Well, I mentioned earlier 25 bleed, but it's 50% plus HP, but that doesn't really make a difference because on early game, well, we'll get into the intricacies of that later. But every single skill he has, at minimum, takes 10 self-bleed damage. And that's extremely important because when you're playing bleed, you're not going to have a bleed stack at turn 1. You're going to need turns for that. And because Blood Feast, we'll see in how many ways that actually helps with that, has so many beneficial effects that how are you supposed to get it in the first place if you don't have a bleed stack? Priestcracker is there to make that consistent, doing self-bleed on himself on early turns to give you that fuel you need. And he has this on every single skill. He is going to be consistently fueling your team every single time. So we see here the tank and the engine of the group. Now I do want to talk about his skills more. He has aggro on all his skills. If you don't know what that does, that means a lot of skills are going to direct to him a lot more, yada yada yada. But his unique status, which most Blood Fiends are going to have, I'll take a sip of water here, is Bloodied Hand. Bloodied Hand's effects, not that important to talk about. All it does is give you more Rupture, but the most important thing about Bloodied Hand is that it's used for its S3. Now, you're going to see a concurrent theme on all the Blood Fiends. Their S3 is going to be the quote-unquote payoff of their whole gimmick. Their gimmick being Blood Feast, or you can consume Blood Feast for additional effect, blah blah blah. Well, that effect is going to be used for your S3. S3 is going to consume all these stacks, and they're going to give benefits based on whether or not they reach a certain threshold. The benefits for S3 is coin power +1 and just a reuse. Pretty simple stuff. You don't really need it that often because, well, he cannot consume Blood Feast unless he's at 5+ Ailing Heart. I made that sound a lot less important than it actually is. He cannot consume Blood Feast until you're at turn 5 or more. His S2 is the only method of getting Blood Feast. Of consuming Blood Feast, sorry. So this identity, you're not going to see him consume Blood Feast very often because he's going to be fueling the team. He's a very selfless identity. He cannot consume it past turn 5. So you have a lot of these early turns where he's fueling your Blood Feast stack, and he's not consuming any by himself. So we're already seeing, oh, he's an identity that's going to be sitting in the backline, not sitting in the backline, I'm sorry, using his skills, not being very active, not being the huge damager, but he is going to be the one fueling it for your other teammates. Sorry for going silent there. I'm sorry. I don't know if you heard that, but someone just knocked on my window. I looked outside. There was no one. Okay, whatever. Schizo ramblings. And his S2 gives him a lot of bleed hand. When I say a lot, I mean a lot. He gains 10 bloody hand just from an S2. But he consumes 60 blood feast. That's a lot. You say that, but he only consumes it past turn 5. And past turn 5, there's a very huge likelihood you're gonna have a decent bleed stack. And even though you don't have a decent bleed stack, you're gonna be sub-bleeding so much that you're gonna have it anyway. And on later turns, you're gonna notice that once you have a bleed stack going, that bleed stack is going to go on a lot. Very, very long, especially when you have the right tools to actually maintain it. So consuming blood feast, on Pretty case, isn't even that greedy, because you're gonna have a lot of blood feast when you're at turn 5 plus anyway. And I mentioned earlier how heal is so good on this identity. His S3, guess what, heals based on damage dealt. And he deals more damage based on missing HP on self. That's insane. You're at 40% less HP, you have an S3, you heal on hit, you heal on the S3 as well, and you reuse. That is amazing. You are healing based on damage dealt, you are dealing more damage. This identity does nuke damage. I said earlier how this identity doesn't do a lot of damage, but when you have conditionals fulfilled and then you're at turn 5 plus, this identity is going to be easily healing 100 plus HP in a single turn while having no stagger threshold, having high defense level, and dealing massive damage. His damage conditionals are not to be messed with. He has 2 coin power max conditionals, rolling up to a 23 with a max of 90% damage boost, which generally you can have like 40% to 50%, but still, that is extremely high amounts, especially with a reuse, which is going to bump that up to a 28 rolling skill tree. These are very, very high numbers. So again, this identity has so many good things going for him. A tank, well, I'll summarize it later, but we'll talk about bleed count now. S2 plus 2 bleed count, S3 plus 2 bleed count. Standard bleed count amounts, nothing to talk about here. I do want to mention, however, although it's not in this side in particular, his guard skill. His guard skill is a standard guard skill, but it activates bleed on himself, which is not going to come in handy too often unless you're in Kanto 7, where a certain status, well, why am I saying certain? A bleed is going to be very prevalent and you're going to want to cleanse it fast. But in other situations, it's going to give you like 5 bleed and that's it. So 5 blood feast, tier bank. Damn drop of water to the waterfall. But what's important about the guard skill is he gains 3 Ailing Heart when you use it, and that accelerates it. There's not a lot of situations where you really want to use it below turn 5, because that means his S2 is going to be consuming blood feast. And although his S1 doesn't consume any, losing a skill that's supposed to be fueling your team just to gain Bloodied Hand, which isn't going to be very relevant until later turns, especially when in later turns, you're not exactly going to see Gregor at below 50% HP. She's going to be high HP. So his payoff isn't even going to be that good anyway. So I don't really use the guard often unless I want to force Last Resonance. And I will mention how important Last Resonance is later, but just a handy thing I want to point out later. What is useful about it though is when you're above 5 Ailing Heart. When you're above 5 Ailing Heart, well, you're already consuming blood feast anyway, so might as well just accelerate it, get to 10 Ailing Heart, and then you have a lot of defense level. You have +1 defense level, plus defense level conditionally, and you have max Ailing Heart immediately. Another reason why I don't really like using Ailing Heart below turn 5 is the SP heal. Very underrated part of Gregor's kit. SP heal is extremely good, and losing some SP heal just to consume Bloodied Hand, which is going to come in handy for the early turns as I mentioned earlier, that's just not worth it in my opinion. To sum things up, a good amount of bleed count, tank ID with high defense level, and one of the highest health stats in the game. In my opinion, the highest potential health stats in the game for potential man himself. Why? He has so much bleed in his kit. Theoretically, he can infinitely live, because he just has a bunch of healing in his kit, and we'll talk about that later. He has really good egos that can heal himself and his allies. He is extremely hard to kill. 1 stagger threshold, very tanky ID, healing, and he's the fuel to Blood Feast. He is bleeding himself. He has good scaling. I didn't mention this earlier, but he has really good scaling. Coin power plus 1 for every 6 bleed on the target on every single one of his skills, which is very, very good. Just scaling numbers, which is good for late game, especially when you have a bleed stack. And what else is there to say? I mentioned so many good things about this identity. He is a very good identity bleed, if you couldn't tell from what I'm already saying. He is extremely good. I'd say he's the spine to a Blood Feast team. And moving on from the spine, I'd say Rodion is a supporting member. I wouldn't say she is core. I'd say she is supporting. She is good to have, but when you're starting to build a bleed team, I wouldn't really see her as the first identity you would shard or get. Because Rodion is more of a finishing touch to the bleed team, and we'll see why that's the case. So let's talk about Blooming Thorn, which is her unique status. She gains a truer passive, which she gains by taking bleed damage when allies take bleed damage or when they consume Blood Feast. So having other allies that take bleed damage on self, Tus Priest Gugger, which took bleed damage on self, and we'll see other identities that consume Blood Feast. They accelerate her game plan, which is getting Blooming Thorn. Now, we're just immediately talking about Blooming Thorn. Blooming Thorn is a status that gives you defense level and inflicts bleed on your opponent when they attack you. The bleed is only 1, so not that important. But I do want to talk about, however, the defense level. Defense level was, if I remember correctly, she gives about 3 max defense level, which is pretty good. That's like a 9, that's like 1 protection. If you didn't know, 1 defense level is like 3% damage reduction, which is pretty good. So again, 1 protection, and we'll see how she gives it to other allies later. We only just talk about how she gains it for herself, through her passive. But Blooming Thorn is that, and Blooming Thorn is used as a payoff for S3, and we'll see that later. But we'll see the rest of her kit first. Her S1 and S2 is similar to Priestcracker in terms of scaling. She gains a little bit of self-bleed. Compared to Gregor, she gains a lot less self-bleed. S1 would bleed like 25 at 50% plus HP for Priestcracker, but Rodion only has like 5 bleed on self, 5 bleed on self, 5 bleed on self. So you'll see here, something you'll notice in a lot of the bleed identities, a lot of these bleed identities are not going to be bleeding self that much, which makes Priestcracker all the more useful. You have S1, which is Pride, very important for the bleed team because Pride you can't find anywhere in the bleed team. And that's gonna be your main source of Pride. But the funny thing is, her counter, a clashable counter, is actually better rolling than it. And it has better effects than it, at least in my opinion. Because, well, it could inflict +1 bleed count on the second coin. And it actually reduces bleed count for your allies, which isn't that important. And on Clash Win, you gain 4 Blooming Thorn. That is a very fast way to gain Blooming Thorn, especially when you don't have a bleed stack. And it just rolls better unconditionally. It has a base of 5. Although Be Gone, S1, has a max roll of 15, on base, her counter can roll 13, while her base S1 can only roll 11. So on the first few turns, her counter is actually going to be better, especially when starting a bleed stack, because, you know, +1 bleed count. So it's pretty useful for like neutral amounts, like a little bit of bleed count, and it's gonna be useful for starting them anyway in the first place and getting like small bleed stacks just to gain blood feast in the first few turns. It's only very useful for that. And it's Lust, which is extremely important. I keep saying Lust is very important. Actually, I'll stop saying that until we get to the ID that actually makes it very important. So what makes Rodion Rodion? What makes her actually good? Well, the main reason why people run her is not because of defense level from Blooming Thorn. If you didn't read earlier, S1, she gives Blooming Thorn to allies, prioritizing Blood Fiends. And that prioritization is going to be very important when I talk about her S2. S2 is a skill that gives you +2 bleed count. Already extremely good. 3 coins with good scaling, with a max roll of about 22, very high rolling. The most important part about it, however, is she gives 2 attack power up. She only gives 1 attack power on base, but she gives 2 attack power up when your ally is a Blood Fiend. And she gives it to the least max HP, and that's going to be very important later down the line when I talk about the identity that actually gets it in the bleed team. 2 attack power up on an S2, that's very, very good. 2 attack The attack power up is going to give you very, very good clashing, especially when you'll notice the attack power up isn't even locked behind a Blood Feast consumption. Blood Feast consumption for Rodion is only for Blooming Thorn. So on the first turn, if you use your S2, you get a free 2 attack power up out of nowhere. That is amazing. If you didn't realize, 2 attack power up for free on demand on an S2 that is going to be very frequent is extremely good. That's going to be extremely helpful for clashing and just general damage. And Rodion herself doesn't even deal that bad of a damage in the first place. 22 rolling with very easy to fulfill conditionals and very good bleed count. You're going to be seeing this skill a lot. And even in turns where you don't really need damage up, it's just a generally good skill to use. Plus 2 bleed count, okay damage. It's just generally amazing. And that's going to be your main game plan for Rodion. She's going to give you 2 attack power up, and that's going to happen very, very frequently. But the second reason why I want to Rodion, and her late fight rather, damage potential is on her S3. The festival will end. Her S3 activates at 25 plus Blooming Thorn, but we'll just talk about the unactivated part first. The unactivated part just gives you Festive Fever, which is a status that gives you damage up. Gives you more damage up based on gives you more damage up if the affected ally is a Blood Fiend, but she gives Festive Fever based on your resonance, more allies gets it, and she gives you more Festive Fever the more Blood Feast consume. So again, playing into this late game strategy, you notice this a lot for a lot of the Blood Fiends. I mentioned earlier, late game Priest Trigger, late fight for Princess Rodion. You notice how a lot of the identities, they shine when you are late into a fight, because at that point in the fight, you're gonna be getting so much Blood Feast and so much bleed procs that you're gonna be getting these S3s a lot. And because the S3 is your payoff skill, those are going to be activated later into the fight, and you're going to have access to extremely powerful high damaging skills. And Princess Rodion has exactly that. Her S3 enhance, although difficult to see right now, all you have to know is that it does the exact same thing as the unenhanced S3, except it has AoE, attack weight of 3, while also having more Festive Fever and dealing more damage based on Blood Feast consumed. So just even more damage and more Festive Fever while having AoE. AoE is extremely useful. And you don't have high damaging AoE very often in Limbus Company. Bleed is one of the few statuses that has access to AoE. AoE, attacking multiple enemies at once, and especially when on a skill that is high damaging such as Rodion's. I mentioned earlier, the buff and the Blood Feast consume damage buff. Those are going to be very, very, very good. Add on top of that, AoE, that's going to be having extremely high damage potential, especially against enemies with multiple body parts or just chain battles. And Bleed, unlike other statuses, are one of the only statuses that actually has consistent AoE. A lot of statuses might have like AoE on egos, but Princess Rodion has it on base kit. And on base kit, that's very, very rare. You don't see that a lot. Heathcliff, but we don't talk about him. So yeah. And a minor part of the kit that I will talk about is that she heals HP on self by 20% of the damage dealt with base skills, and if she's at max HP, she heals other allies, so she has a little bit of sustain for herself. I also want to mention, although I didn't make this a big deal, that she cleanses bleed, which is very important if you're heading into Canto 7, but not that important for other situations. So, my overall thoughts on Princess Lamachan and Rodion. I mentioned earlier, I don't think she is that important for Bleed. You notice that how I didn't rant about her as much as Priest Trigger, and that is correct. Because she doesn't have a lot for her going. She's not really the fuel. She is just giving small buffs. She has really good AoE, but she had that 2 attack power up is key to her being played in Bleed teams. But I do want to point out she has amazing sin affinities. Pride and Envy. Envy is not a sin affinity you see often in Bleed, and it's just nice to have. And Pride is her only source of pride. She has very good sin affinities, and that is the reason why she's played. And being a Rodion identity, she has access to one of the most core egos in Bleed. But I'll talk about that later. I also do want to point out just a small thing before we get going, is the difference in consumption of Blood Feast. Crusader earlier actually consumes Blood Feast on use, and Princess Lamacha and Rodion consumes it on combat start. There's just small differences in it, but what you need to know, although there's different aspect. Okay, I'll just talk about this later. Right now, Blood Feast, the ID that is prioritized when consuming Blood Feast is identities that are of the higher kindred, and Gregor is the lowest kindred, the third kindred, and Rodion is the second kindred, the second highest kindred, while a certain identity later is the first highest kindred. So Rodion is going to consume Blood Feast first, and although you might think, oh, that's bad, that's not going to be very good, there's a couple bonuses to it. On combat start, if you're on combat start, if you're at 0 bleed stack, okay, let's say you're at 0 bleed stack, right? You have 0 Blood Feast on the bag, turn 1, you use Rodion skills, combat start, oh, you gain self bleed, 5 bleed into the stack, and then you proc bleed in the middle of those clashes. Because it's combat start, she's not gonna consume it in the first place. Even if she's the slowest identity, she's not gonna consume it on last. She's gonna be on combat start. And if it's on combat start, that means on combat start you use it, and in the middle of clashes you proc bleed. That bleed goes into the Blood Feast, and then an ally that has unused Blood Feast consumes it. So there's a couple of benefits. There's a couple of disadvantages. Unused Blood Feast is of course gonna lose to combat start Blood Feast if there's a current Blood Feast stack, but unused Blood Feast has the benefit of, oh, you can calculate how much bleed procs are gonna do, and then they consume it, blah blah, and the combat start Blood Feast ID is not gonna be able to get those bonuses on the next turn. Just little things there, not that important to mention. A lot of people made a big deal about, oh, this identity, they're gonna be consuming Blood Feast first. This is gonna be terrible for bleed. You shouldn't run them. Blah, blah, blah. Well, not that serious, but there were a couple of discussions about that. But after they released, well, people realized, oh, it's not that important because it's combat start. So, finishing thoughts on Princess Launch and Rodion. She has a good amount of bleed count. I didn't really mention this earlier, but she has +2 bleed count on S2, which is something I already talked about. But she actually inflicts a lot of bleed count on her S3, which inflicts +1 bleed count and +2 bleed count on unenhanced and enhanced respectively. By the way, don't be afraid of using S3s early. I'll mention how that's going to play out later. But her AoE S3 hits really hard. If you ever played Princess Lamacha and Rodion, she does, like, at bare minimum with 3 targets, like 150 damage. That's like 50-ish damage for each of the targets, and that's pretty decent. Especially when you are giving Festive Fever to all your allies, you are inflicting damage on multiple body parts, you are starting bleed stacks on multiple body parts, you are giving 3 damage up to your entire team based on real resonance, and it is a lust skill. I keep specifying lust skills. I keep specifying lust skills, and it is an integral part of bleed. And just like Piece of Lamshana and Gregor, she has really good scaling on all her skills, and her 2 attack power up for both herself and on her Blood Fiend is incredible, and I'll be talking about the identity that is going to be receiving that soon. I neglected to mention this earlier, but she actually gives +2 attack power up on herself as well. So she gives a total of 2 attack power up on herself and 2 attack power up on IDs. She, on other identities, she is an extremely good clasher. She makes your team clash. She is also, just like Priestkicker, making bleed consistent. Something really important about bleed that I want to emphasize is consistency. And Lamanchala and Rodion and Lamanchala and Gregor is exactly that. 2 attack power up on early turns is extremely useful for beating out those hard-hitting skills early. And that consistency is exactly why bleed is now good with Blood Fiends. So, moving on to the next Blood Fiend, and probably the most important Blood Fiend out of all of them. The manager of La Mancha Land, Don Quixote. I believe that when Manager of La Mancha Land Don Quixote was released, she was one of the strongest identities. She is still one of the strongest identities, although some IDs have taken her spot, say Malfast on her peak potential in a Rupture team, We have been introduced to a couple of really strong identities over the past few updates, but Manager of La Mancha Land, Don Quixote, has still retained her position as one of the strongest identities in Limbus, especially in a bleed team, and we'll be seeing shortly how that's the case. I think that when Manager of Don Quixote was released, well, before she was released, Bleed was actually in a pretty good spot. Like, with the introduction of the Blood Fiends, that will already replace like a lot of the really bad Bleed identities because we didn't have good Bleed identities back then. It was already in a really good spot. It needed a finishing oomph and a certain ID before the entirety of season 7, sorry, Canto 7, was released, was already giving that a lot of oomph. But when Manager of Don Quixote was released, she just spiked the power level of Bleed to an insane degree. Well, we'll be seeing shortly how that's the case. First, I want to look at our base stats. 47 speed, very speed identity. A lot of identities have this speed range now, but still, that doesn't devalue it. 55 defense level, so we're just looking at a fragile identity, taking like 50% more damage from normal skills at 60 offense level. Stagger threshold of 3, which is pretty fragile, so we're already looking at a very fragile identity. But 182 health. Usually I'd say health first, but why didn't I? That's because I believe that the health of this identity is actually very, very important. Her max HP is 182, and if you recall previously on the two other Blood Fiends, Gregor has around 290 HP, 270 HP, 270 to 290 approximately. Dulcinea Rodion having around 230 to 220, I believe. And so we're really looking at Don Quixote as the lowest max HP center. Why does that matter? Earlier I mentioned Princess Lamachan and Rodion's S2, which gives 2 attack power up, max to a Blood Fiend, and prioritizes Blood Fiends with the lowest max HP. And she has the lowest max HP. So, because it's max HP, it's not gonna matter how low you are, how healed up you are. You're always gonna get that buff. So already, this identity is getting permanently buffed from Dulcinea Rodion at a regular interval, with her 2 attack power up being on an S2, showing how it's really, really good. And because she's getting 2 attack power up permanently, well, she's getting buffed permanently, 2 attack power up on every single skill. But 2 attack power up isn't really going to change an ID that much, is it? If any ID had 2 attack power up, sure, they'll be good, but it's not really going to be game changing, is it? So we'll be looking at her kit now. But just keep in mind that this identity is continuously getting buffed by Dulcinea Rodion every few turns, and you can set up turns with it, and you can really win some low SP clashes with it. You can break through some clashes, like say you have a base of 3, and the enemy also has a base of 3. Well, you had Dulcinea attack power up right there, you would actually win that clash if they landed like 2 tails, and you also landed 2 tails, you would actually win that. So it breaks a lot of tiebreakers at low SP. But other than that, it's just very, very good in general to have like 2 attack power up. What can I say? So, Aramudara de Sangre, which has a 4 Lust Own, which is pretty easily achievable. We'll be seeing how that's the case later. But after attack, if the enemy is defeated, increase blood feed by 10% of the target's max HP. Gain 1 damage up next turn for every 50% missing HP at turn end. So not very important, but so the first line isn't that important. You don't really see that happening too often, other than in chain battles, and even then it's just meh, not that great. It's okay in chain battles. I'll say it's okay in chain battles. 1 damage up for every 50% missing HP, especially when she has 3 stagger thresholds, which she is going to be taking a lot of damage once she gets staggered. So you're going to be definitely getting a lot of damage up once you get staggered, but you'll actually heal up later anyway, and we'll be seeing how she heals up later. But moving on, if an ally is about to be defeated from bleed damage, prevent from being defeated from bleed damage for the turn. If you are a good bleed player, I don't believe this is going to be coming in handy that often, unless you're being like really pressured. One ID has died. With healing egos, I feel like you're just never gonna see this happen often. I've seen it happen on one of my fights in Canto 8, but overall you're not really gonna see this happen in action. But it is a good bonus if you are not managing your pre-skirker properly. Variant Sancho Hardblood Arts, which is the most important thing, and is this entire ID's gimmick. Earlier we talked about Bloodied Hand and Blooming Thorn. Well, this identity has Hardblood. Hardblood is a status which gives her min and max fast speed value for every 10 Hardblood, with a max of 7 to 10 speed, of extremely high amount of speed right there, with Hardblood 1, Hardblood 2, Hardblood 3, same exact structure as the previous statuses that you consume Blood Feast for. and it gives you offense level and defense level at stage 3. So just casual stuff there, but although very good buffs, especially the speed one, that's not the main point. The main point is this. Turn start at 15 plus hard blood, her skills get empowered depending on what identities you have on your team. Say you have Priest Gregor, Priest Gregor. Actually, no. I'll just talk about that later because I do want to look at her skills first. Another passive she has is in encounter, if another allied Lawanchalan unit is defeated, gain 1 more hard blood. When 3 other Lawanchalan units are defeated, gain even more hard blood and responsibility, which is just take 20% more damage and deal 20% more damage. You're not going to be seeing this type very often. Until you get to fights that you actually struggle in, I'd say in like Canto 7, Canto 8 is when the difficulty ramps up a lot. You generally aren't going to be seeing this effect go off, but it is definitely useful. Just 1 additional hard blood on top of that. I don't think you're going to be seeing the second line too often because, you know, Manager Dawn is the most fragile one. I feel like if you were to make a mistake, Manager Dawn is definitely going to die first. But hey, you never know. I've personally never seen me have the second line ever active, but I've definitely seen the first line active. So, onwards to her skills. Firstly, when we look at her, well, reveal kit, I just want to mention Kim Ji-hoon purposely gave this ID every single affinity that Bleed was lacking. You never see Sloth in Bleed. Not a single identity has Sloth in Bleed. Don Quixote is the only identity that does Bleed that has Sloth. So just from the kit reveal, when we were teased with it, it just looked like she was given every single synergy that Bleed was struggling with. S2 especially, Rough skill. A Rough skill and a S1 Sloth skill. That is amazing for Bleed. Of course, you have some Rough here and there, but having even more Rough is just very good, very good. Especially when synergies are pretty important for Bleed. Well, let's talk about our kit now. So our S1 is a okay rolling skill, scales pretty well, just like every single other Blood Fiend earlier, S2 as well, S3 as well. Just generally talking about their rolls, yep, they're pretty good, they scale the same way. An important thing to mention, she heals a lot. Although you wouldn't really assume that at first. She actually heals a damn lot. She is really good at sustaining herself. Like, heal 30% of the max HP damage dealt, that's gonna heal you like 3-4. And that's really pretty good amounts. S2, okay, it is on hit, heal 30% of the HP damage dealt. So it actually triggers actually no. Nah, I'll just talk about the consumption first actually. Because then we'll be getting to the AoE aspects of it and blah, blah, blah. Okay, well. So S1 is the most effective way to gain hard blood. Earlier I talked about hard blood and how important it is. Well, I'll talk about explaining hard blood later, but just know S1 is the most important thing you use to gain hard blood, because as you can see from the line here, on use consume up to 50 blood feast and gain 1 hard blood for every 5 blood feast consumed. So you're consuming 50 for 10 hard blood, which is a good amount. If we look at the S2, consume up to 50 blood feast and gain 1 hard blood for every 10 blood feast. So you're only getting 5 blood feasts for 5 hard blood for 50 blood feasts. Not a great deal. So already we're looking at an identity that is more so encouraged to use her S1, and this is one way that Kim Ji-hoon used to make IDs use their S1 more, that is giving them a rare sin affinity and giving them a unique niche. And in Manager Don Quixote's case, she has a unique affinity and she has a unique case, which is this is the most effective way to get hard blood. Next, her S2. Her S2 is very, very interesting. We don't see this very often. She has regular attack weight. Regular attack weight on a skill, on a normal skill. We saw earlier from Rodion there, she had a skill on her S3 that does it. And it's her cash out skill. This identity has it regularly. It's her S2. You see here, attack weight for every 10 hard blood itself. So if you have 20 hard blood, you have 2 attack weight. So that means you're going to have 3 attack weights. So you're going to be attacking 3 people at once. Extremely strong effect, if you can tell. Attack weight on any skill is already extremely, extremely good. You don't see that often, especially on a normal skill. This is one of the few instances of a attack weight skill on a normal skill. And just to mention that, on hit skill, heal 30% of the damage dealt. So you would think it would heal like max 10. even if you hit 3 targets. But because it is on hit, that means it is counted separately. So if you hit 3 people with it, you're gonna be healing 3 times off of it, proccing it 3 times. So you're gonna be healing like around 10 HP ish on a total, not including if you have max HP rolls, max HP. Attack power up attack power up effects, and stagger threshold, increase damage, stagger damage, multipliers like fragile, damage up, etc. So it's not even counting that. You're gonna be healing like 10 every turn with this. So we're looking at an ID that's very fragile, but she does sustain herself very well. When she gets staggered, she's actually going to be slowly working her way up back to her HP in like 4 3 turns. She's going to be at like 150, 140 after she gets staggered. She has really good sustain, and she takes off chip very well. So even if she is fragile, if you know you can tank a skill, she is not a bad choice because you can just heal it back up very, very fast. Next up is her S3. I mentioned how earlier, well, Royan has a cash out on her S3. Well, Don Quixote also has a cash on S3. I would usually put in the enhanced version here as well, but I'd rather show it with the other versions, and I do feel like it's worth talking about her S3 more than Rodion, especially when Rodion was just like not that much of an upgrade. It's just attack rate and damage buffs, which is pretty big, but not that interesting. In Don Quixote's case, her S3 actually has a unique niche scenario where you want to use it. So, just a small review on the S3. Okay rolling, good scaling as always. Blood Feast consumption is the same as the S2. But the most interesting line we want to talk about is the final line. After attack, if the target is defeated, increase Blood Feast by 60 and gain 10 Hard Blood. So 60 Blood Feast really isn't that bad. It's actually quite a lot of Blood Feast actually. It's a really good way to start off the fight, especially when you're probably going to be using this at 3 or 4 turns after the fight starts, which is where you probably have like only 40 to 50 Blood Feast. So it is definitely a good buff, and especially the 10 Hard Blood, allowing you to completely get a lot of Hard Blood, especially since you're using her S3 under 15 Hard Blood. I mentioned earlier how the 15 Hard Blood actually enhances your skills, meaning it replaces them, especially when you only have less than 15 Hard Blood. Getting 10 Hard Blood, especially on top of the previous turns you were doing, stacking up the Hard Blood earlier, and just getting bleed conditionals, and killing the enemy, you're going to be having a lot of Hard Blood, and immediately you're probably going to have the enhanced skill next turn. So this S3 actually has a unique purpose, which is if there's a killable enemy, especially one that is extremely fragile, her S3 is definitely going to be useful in that regard, especially against enemies that, say, summon very low health targets. Certain enemies do it like that. Her S3 is going to be coming really handy. A certain staggered enemy, well, you can use her S3 along with other skills to get them low enough to kill them with the S3. And since it's not tied to a specific coin, any coin works for S3, so you don't have to do a lot of calculations. You probably have the correct raw damage in mind. If you are playing Limbus Company for at least a decent amount of time, you can probably predict the amount of damage it can deal. And so, unlike other Blood Fiends, her S3 without the cash out version is actually pretty useful. So I mentioned earlier the whole enhanced thing. Well, before we get into that, let's just talk about our clashable counter first. Yes, she has a clashable counter. The clashable counter is the same consumption, no bleed conditionals though, which is important to note. What is important to note though is that it is actually stronger than S1 at the beginning of a fight. Even if you actually don't have Blood Feast, it's actually worth it to use her counter skill instead because you gain more bleed if you don't consume Blood Feast. And not only that, you do +2 bleed count and you do roll more than your base S1. So although S1 is the best way to gain Hard Blood, her counter is a good starter skill. It has a good base, and although sometimes you want to use the S1 just because it is sloth and you want to get sloth affinity, her counter is definitely going to be very useful, especially with the +2 bleed count, which is going to be really helpful in maintaining bleed count even after the early turns. Her counter is actually really strong, especially against enemies where you want to maintain bleed count. It's going to be really helpful in maintaining that bleed count. And just +2 additional procs on demand. You don't see a lot of ITVs have this, and even then, Rodion only has it on +1 bleed count. So +2 bleed count on demand is actually really strong, especially when you are trying to get bleed stacks as fast as possible, and you have a really good skill rotation. But your Manager Dawn just doesn't have the correct Hard Blood or the correct skill rotation for your good enhanced skills. Well, her counter is going to be really useful for that. And it inflicts Shimmering Blood Fiend, which isn't that important. It does give you like shield, but most of the time when I use it, even with the max conditionals, I at max get like 10 shield. It's okay, but not something you really look forward to when using it. So, her enhanced skills. So you're already seeing a lot of text here. Something you might notice is that instead of putting the S2 enhance, I put in the counter enhance. Why is that the case? Because I am excluding a certain Blood Fiend from what I'm talking about because I don't think the S2 enhance is that worth to talk about and it's not that interesting compared to the others, so I'll be skipping it. So I mentioned earlier, let's actually go back just to make this clearer. Her second passive, at 15 plus hard blood, if each following unit is either defeated or pressing this counter, empower the unit this unit's leftmost slot. The Priest of Launch on Gregor, empower skill 1. The Barber of Launch on Otis, empower skill 2. This unit, empower skill 3. And Priest of Launch on Rodion, empower defense skill. So what that means is, say, you have only Priest Gregor on your team. You do not have Rodion on your team. That means you are not going to have your defense skill enhanced if you have 15 plus hard blood, it's just going to stay on the base. Luckily, you have the S3 permanently unlocked because it depends on whether or not this unit is in the battlefield, and well, this unit is on the battlefield if you're getting the enhanced skill, so of course. And likewise, if you only have Rodion but no Gregor, you're not going to get the enhanced S1. So, very team dependent. This is a reason why Bleed is quite expensive and I don't really recommend it to newer players, is because just because of this identity, if you don't have the resources to get the other Blood Fiends, you are really locked behind a lot of potential. So you really have to unlock, like, say, like, Magidon along with a second Blood Fiend at the very least to get, like, some sort of value. That's also why I say Gregor. Why Gregor? Because I think her S1 is the best enhanced out of all of them. Generally, even though, yes, S3 is extremely really strong, but I feel like S1 is really underrated, and although her S3 is the most powerful nuke, one of the most powerful nukes in the game, her S1 is still something to be feared of. Although it doesn't deal that much damage by itself, what I want to point out is several things about it. First, Sloth. It's still Sloth. Incredibly high rolls. 3 coins with good power, good coin power. That is a 19 rolling S1. A 19 rolling S1 is really, really good. Something I want to talk about is that on use, gain 20 bleed. This is extremely useful, especially in early turns where you don't really have a nuke turn, you don't really want to set up a bleed stack turn, so you don't use your S3. We'll talk about the S3 later, but you don't really want to use the S3 because it is still the earlier rounds, and you don't really want to set up bleed stack because you can't maintain it, so instead you use the S1. Why would you want to use the S1? Because on use you gain 20 bleed. That's going to be very useful for stacking up your various Blood Feast shenanigans for your other Blood Fiends, especially Rodion. And she inflicts +1 more bleed on hit for every 10 hard blood, which is not that important, but it's there. A max of 8 bleed on the S1, that's really, really useful. I would just want to point out, because she gains 20 bleed, that's actually quite strong, because one important thing about this identity that I didn't mention earlier because I wanted to mention the enhances one first, when other units among allies take bleed damage or consume blood feast, gain 2 hard blood on self. This doesn't matter about the amount of blood feast that you consume, so you can consume like 5 blood feasts and she still gains a 2 hard blood. This is another reason as to why she is actually extremely team dependent. She ramps a lot faster when you have actual blood fiends on your team. So again, another reason why it's quite expensive to run bleed. So that 20 bleed is actually going to be very, very useful for giving your bleed identities a chance to not only give her even more hard blood, well, you're going to be giving her hard, actually no. Yeah, my point is not that important because even if you consume like little bleed into blood feast, then as long as you consume a little blood feast into bleed, you're gonna be giving her that stack anyway. So my point isn't relevant. Sorry, ignore just what I said earlier, except for the passive. That passive is really important. So what I like about this identity is that 20 bleed, that's going to help you set up for herself. So because you're not at the opportune moment to use her S3, because you don't really want to start a bleed stack, you can instead just use her S1, that's 8 bleed potency and 20 bleed on self. If they have a bleed count, even if it's like little, like 2 or 3, 8 bleed potency, that's gonna give you like 24, 32 blood feast. That is extremely high amounts of blood feast. And because she's setting up for herself, she gets to get to her S3 even faster. And to help her get to her S3 faster, she doesn't even consume all of her heart blood. She only consumes 10. So say you're at 30 heart blood, which is pretty achievable, especially if you're just spamming S1s, well, you get to stay at 20 heart blood, and you get to use another skill using heart blood next turn again. This is an extremely important reason why her S1 is really strong. You get to spam it like a lot, and because you're spamming a lot, you're setting it for yourself, you're setting up blood feast for your entire team. You are basically setting yourself up for the rest of the fight by giving yourself a lot of blood feast to work with, and it's not even a bad skill in the first place. Another reason why it's good: activate bleed on target once. This is extremely good on staggered targets that have bleed stacks. This is extremely good in general just for activating bleed once, even though you don't really want it. It's still just okay. I'd say it really comes in clutch when you have an actual bleed stack. When you have a pre stack stack, which is I'd say around like 7 or 8 9 bleed count. It's extremely useful in those cases. Keep in mind though, count your bleed procs. Count your bleed procs if you want to use a skill. You never want to use a skill if at the end of the turn it's gonna diminish your bleed count stack. It's never gonna be good that way. And just make sure you have enough count to keep it up for next turn. So if you can't tell, I really like her S1. I really like skills that give you long-term value, and her S1 is exactly that, especially combined with her unique activated and target at once, which is not something you really see often, especially on basic skills. Actually, I believe this is the only skill that activates bleed on a basic skill. Extremely accessible, very cheap to get. You easily get to the next hard blood. It's very cheap to use. You can throw it out anytime. It's gonna always get value. Next, her counter. Her counter, I believe, is the exact same, and not that much difference about it. You get to have more of that shimmering blood fiend I mentioned earlier on more allies. Again, not that important. I only get like 10 shield HP, and that's not very important. If you want to know what it does, I didn't mention earlier, sorry about that. But what it does, in summary, is it gives you shield based on your blood feast, and that shield, if you take bleed damage of the shield, it just doesn't. Actually, I don't recall the effect. That's something I just realized. I really don't recall this fact. That just gives like a sense of how not important the skill is. Because if I actually give a damn about the skill, I'd actually know what it actually does. Actually, no, I believe that if wait no wait no oh yeah, I remember now. Okay, I thought earlier it was like, oh, if you take bleed damage, it's gonna become Blood Feast. Well, that's fucking dumb. That's how Blood Feast works in the first place. I think it was like any damage that you take with this shield is gonna be converted into Blood Feast. I think that's an actual skill. Yeah, that's an actual skill. I'm pretty sure. That's the actual effect of the skill. I didn't put it on the side because it's not that important. But I believe that's the effect of the skill. So just more of that. Most of the time, I only get like 10 shield HP, and when you're at that amount, at 10 shield HP, usually if you like use it at early turns, it's like 3 or 4, horrible to use. If you're like 10 or more, when you're at 10 or more Shimmering Blood Fiend, you're already at a point in a game where you have consumed so much Blood Feast, you probably have a already stacked blood stack on the boss or the enemy, that you have enough Blood Feast to go around anyway. So it doesn't really matter in the first place anyway if you're using this to gain Blood Feast. It's just additional HP, which I don't really see myself using often. I often see this as just an additional thing on top of her on-hit effect, which plus 3 bleed count. If you are in trouble of maintaining bleed stack, her counter is gonna always be there. Yes, you are forced to clash, you cannot go unopposed with it, so you cannot stack it and then clash with it. But when you are in situations where you're able to actually clash, her counter is definitely going to be very, very useful, plus 3 bleed count. This is going to be enhanced further when I talk about a different identity, specifically a passive that helps this inflict even more bleed count. I guess so, just plus 3 bleed count. I don't really explain how good that is. That is going to be helping you maintain it a lot longer. Well, yeah, not that much to talk about the counter. And it just gets improved rolls by plus coin power plus 1 and base power plus 1. Decent rolling skill. Onwards to the next one. Whereas the S1 is for potency, counter is for count, her S3 is both. There is a lot of text on this skill. The exact same conditionals, coin power plus 1, just with more base power, even more coins, plus 1 more coin, unbreakable coins. Unbreakable coins, if you know what unbreakable coins do, which is just if you lose a clash with it, it's gonna still do it just with no coin power. Plus 1 coin power. I'd say it's not that important to this identity because if you're losing a clash with this identity, I feel you're gonna be taking a lot of damage unless you are resistant. Enough damage that, especially late, like turn 3, turn 4, when skill cycles are with like actual damaging skills, your manager Dawn is probably gonna get staggered from that skill. So I wouldn't say that unbreakables are a very huge part of the skill, especially when you are probably still winning any clash with the skill. Rolling a max of, if I remember correctly, 7 times 7 times 4, 28, 32, 35. I believe this rolls a max of 35 or 36 if I remember correctly. Yeah, 35 or 36 with max conditionals. That is an extremely strong skill, and even without conditionals, it is a 25 rolling skill. That is extremely high already. That is more than a couple of already fully max conditional S3s in the game compared to either identities. And it's one of the reasons why Magic Dawn is considered to be the strongest, is because of this skill specifically. Being one of the strongest nukes in the game, extremely accessible, especially because it's just 15 Heartblood and you immediately get it. But in specifically status, specifically bleed, why it's really good, in my opinion at least, is the nuke is really good. I'd say the nuke is really good. At average, it has like 100 damage. A lot of conditionals depending on your bleed. A lot of conditionals depending on blood fees. So many conditionals. But an additional thing that it does is that it inflicts +4 bleed count and 8 potency. That is extremely good. One thing I really like about S3 is that once you have your S3 and you can actually save skills for your other identities that inflict bleed count along until you get a turn where you have 15 Hoblet and you have the S3 enhance in your skill cycle slots. You can save your other bleed count skills, have her S3, have her S3 start the stack because she probably has 7 to 10 speed. She's probably the strongest, she's probably the fastest identity in the entire skill chain. So you use her S3 to start the bleed stack, you have +4 bleed count, and then you maintain it through your other identities with their bleed count skills as well. So that's one thing I really like about this identity. Once you have the S3, it's really easy to find an opportunity where you can start a bleed stack. And even if you already have a bleed stack, it's just gonna give you even more potency and even more count. So extremely good skill in general. Gigantic nuke. Under I'm really like under expressing how good this skill is in terms of nuke. When you're on a staggered enemy and you use the skill, it deals like 250, 300 damage, usually 400, 500, even more than that maybe, on max conditionals. It is an insane skill, especially with how accessible it is. So, but something I really want to mention real quick is that it has the same effect as her normal S3, which is if the target is defeated, increase blood feast by 100 and regain half of heart blood consumed by this skill. So same effect as before, which was you gain more heart blood depending if you kill the enemy or not, and that's gonna be only useful in chain battles I mentioned earlier, or enemies that summon more enemies, or enemies that have wounds. So not important to talk about, but it's pretty nice. One thing I want to mention, very important, very 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 important. After you attack, consume 10 heart blood for every 10 heart blood. So if you're at 30 heart blood, you're gonna consume all the heart blood. If you're at 26 heart blood, you're gonna consume 20 heart blood, because you can't consume 10 over 6, so you're gonna have 6 heart blood left over. Which is why I really like her S1. Her S1 loses you 10 heart blood, and you are passively gaining heart blood from other blood fiends consuming blood feast, assuming you have other blood fiends, which I mentioned earlier, it's just gonna be the ideal team. Of course, you're gonna think the blood fiends, blah 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 blah. So of course you're gonna get these values. You only lose 10 heart blood. You don't lose any of the high amounts of heart blood. And I want to talk about why I don't like the S2 in a very 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 distant slide. But what you just gotta know about our S2 is that it has the same consumption mechanics as her S3, which is it takes up 10 per 10. But her S1, it only consumes 10. And because it only consumes 10 and you're passively getting more and more, if you're only consuming 10, you're gonna having like 8 next turn. Then next turn you get even more, you consume even more, you get like 20. You go to 10 again, and you're left with 10. And then you get even more and more and more. So again, you're seeing how very easily chainable this S1 is, how spammy the skill is, how much you can use the skill very often. You can access to an extremely good skill that sets up for all of your other identities, and it's just decently rolling, good effects, and good potency. you keep using this skill, this is gonna be your filler in every single turn you have heart blood. If you don't have her S3, it's gonna be giving all your other identities opportunities to gain even more heart blood, making you even more sustainable for the later fight. And it only consumes 10. You get to have access to her S3 so fast once you get it. Unlike her S2, which consumes like 10 heart blood, it's gonna be very hard. You're gonna be consuming a lot of heart blood. If you keep using her S2, it's gonna be hard to get back to your S3 as fast. And one thing I like about S1, even if you don't have her S3, even if you have turns where you have like 3 S1s in a row in your skill slot, it's still gonna be really good, because that means you're gonna be like permanently at like 26 heart blood, 30 heart blood most of the time. And this means you're gonna be having 7 to 10 speed on this identity. This identity is gonna be easily the most fastest identity on your team. You have access to a very fast identity. You have access to very high rolling skill ones, a very good skill one at that. And if you want to, you can have a bleed count with her counter. But just so you know, her counter consumes half of hard blood itself. I'd actually say one important thing that I like about her counter is that it's better to use it before you start chaining your S1s if you want to start a bleed count stack, because the more hard blood you have, the less effective the more effective the consumption is going to be, which sounds good, but it's not. You're going to be consuming even more blood fees. You're going to be consuming 15 and down to 15. If you have 15, you're going to be down to 5, 8, but then you have your other blood feeds to back you up. You go to 14 again, you consume S1 again, you get even more hard blood, 24, you consume your S1, and you get even more, and you can start chaining. So, not that I mean, yeah, actually the counter is actually pretty easy to use. You can use it a lot of times, especially since her S1 is so good at gaining blood fees and giving you even more resources to chain that again. By chaining, I mean, by the way, like 20 bleed, giving you like 4 heart blood again. And this is not even including like your other identities. Like Gregor self bleed. Gregor self bleed is like 25, right? You gain like 45 blood fees every single turn. That is very, very strong in S1s. So where Gregor is a engine, Don Quixote has the potential to be an engine once she gets up and going. Once she gets to her S1 her enhances, she can easily start a chain. That is not to say you're prioritizing her S1 over using her S3. No. If you have her S3, use her S3, definitely. But once you use her S3, her S1 is going to be the main skill you're going to be cycling over and over and over again. And that's why she's so strong. She is an extremely consistent identity, giving you even more fuel to your team, along with Priest Gregor, with good rolls, good bleed conditionals, an extremely strong S3, the most fastest identity in your team. No wonder she's one of the strongest identities in the game. She basically has no weaknesses other than just being, quite fragile. And that's it. You can't really point out any other weaknesses. You can't say she has bad coin power. You can't say she has bad clashing. You can't say she has bad uptime. Her uptime is really, really fucking good, especially when you are getting heart blood so often. Purely true, her S1. Purely true, her S1. I can't stress enough, her S1 is amazing. So that's enough from Manager of La Mancha and Don Quixote. Next, onwards. Invincible, fearless, sensual, mysterious, enchanting, vigorous, diligent, overwhelming, gorgeous. Passionate, terrifying, beautiful, powerful. The one and only GOAT, Great Prince Isang.
이제야 완성되었나?
Ring Isang is the godfather of Bleed, and anyone who was there after he was released knows how broken this guy was. I believe it was like 3-4 patch notes from the mail of Kim Ji-hoon saying he wanted to nerf Ring Isang, and he got into this whole controversy just because of him, and everyone was freaking about him in MD. They had to fix his kill so that he doesn't benefit from all the statuses. If you were there, you know. And hey, he didn't get nerfed. He was undoubtedly the strongest identity on release. From his release, he was definitely like just number one immediately. Nobody was competing against Ring Isang in terms of power, especially when you're in a team that is good for him, that is able to cater towards his needs, and he was just unstoppable. And even now, he's still one of the top strongest IDs, extremely consistent damage. There has been a lot of IDs, just like I mentioned earlier with Manager Dawn, some other IDs that has higher caps, higher potential, but Ring Isang is always and will probably always be somewhere along the line of 100% very good. He's still very consistent. So, let's dive into a skip. First, I do want to mention his 3 to 7 speed. Fairly speedy range. I wouldn't say it's the fastest, but it is definitely up there in the fastest. 202 HP, pretty fragile, not that much. 53 defense level, not really much to talk about there. 3 stagger thresholds, fragile identity. Okay, so if you've ever seen Ringy's song and you know what he has done, then you probably already know his kit already. So I don't really need to talk about it that much, but let's just go over it, glossing over it. S1, a Gloom skill. Nobody has Gloom and Bleed. I just want to mention that real quick. I don't believe, yeah, there's barely any Gloom and Bleed unless you're running on the 7th slot with IDs like Red Eyes Ryoshu or Arcorp Mere Salt. You don't have any other source of Gloom. And before we had like a 7-team limit, it was very hard to get Gloom because you would be have to running like, okay, other IDs that just don't have the potential of other IDs that you want to put in your main team. So before the 7th slot, this was a really good synergy, but now it's a lot more there. But it's still worth to mention that it is a good source of Gloom. The skill is also just amazing in general. A base 11 roll with 3 coins. The average roll, if you didn't know, is 3 plus 4 plus 4 for most IDs. And this has 3 coins while still rolling in 11. With just more clash power, up couple count. S2, probably the most talked about skill in Ring Yisang's kit. So if you don't know what it does, basically it rolls a 32 very, very easily. Yes, a 32, which is higher than self-destructive purge, and you don't even need to fulfill any conditionals other than just the reuse conditionals. And the reuse conditionals are very easy to do. If you read here, 40% chance to reuse coin plus 20% more chance to reuse coin for every type of negative effect on a target, 2 times max per skill. You would notice the plus 20% more chance to reuse coin. Okay, so I need 3 different statuses. Well, if you're in the bleed team, which in the context I'm talking about Ring Sang here, yes, we're in the bleed team, then it's already going to be permanently 60% because most of the time you're going to have bleed on the target. Unless Ringy Sang is going first on the first turn, you are definitely going to have like some sort of bleed in there. And even if you don't have bleed, you'll be able to like set it up really easily. Especially with, let's say, a skill that does bleed count. You can have a skill that does bleed count, clash before Ringy Sang, and after they clash, they're going to have the bleed count, right? Because the clash is over, they can't use up any more bleed count, and so we can use our Ringy Sang S2, and that is going to be a permanently 60% chance. Something I want to point out that a lot of people don't understand is that he doesn't proc. Okay, his calculation to proc is counted before he inflicts the random status on his on-hit conditional. So just because he inflicts bleed on his second effect does not mean he's calculating that into his calculations. A lot of people don't understand this. Just because he uses S2 does not mean he already has an 80% chance to use it for free. No, he's still on 40% because he's inflicting the bleed count and the status after he calculates. Because it depends on the order of the line. You see on the line 40% share use coin. The second line is plus 1 bleed count. The third line is plus 3 count. So this is calculated separately, okay? Remember to make your Ring Sang actually proc this. This is an extremely powerful skill. Plus 1 bleed count, reuse 2 times with a very easily reuse conditional that I will explain to you why it's so good later with another ID that boosts the potential of this ID and consistency of this ID by a ton. I will explain that later. But plus 3 bleed count on a full reuse with 32 rolling skill, that is amazing. Especially when I'm gonna talk about another support passive that makes this ID even better. And this skill still has more scaling coin power. You can have a coin power of 10. 10 plus 10 plus 10 plus 8, 38. This rolls a 38 with max conditionals. 40, well no, not 40. 18 on Clash, but 38 on a full blank naked coin on an enemy. Extremely powerful. His S3 is equally as strong. I wouldn't say it's the strongest, but it's your only other source of sloth other than Manager Dawn, and with Manager Dawn, when you're using your counter more in early turns to set up and to maintain things, there's a good reason to highlight the fact that his skill is sloth, because you're gonna be busy using your lust counter skills, you're not gonna have a lot of opportunity to gain that sloth, and that sloth is pretty important for several egos, several side egos. So just having a sloth skill that is actually pretty decent is pretty nice, especially when the skill is at the same as Sanguine Pointillism, very easy to have full conditionals for. Basically, the conditionals are just 3 types of negative effects, inflict additional blah blah blah. The one that I want to point out is his second coin. If the target has 3 plus types of negative effects, inflict +2 additional bleed count. So you can have +3 bleed count on the second coin. Extremely powerful. The other effects don't really matter because, although yes, +3 count for some random statuses are pretty okay, and hey, who knows, you might get bleed. I wouldn't say it's the most important thing, especially when you have another ID that guarantees it anyway. I will mention that it's okay for like, okay, you get a source of sinking, some SP loss, that's pretty okay, right? Some more bleed. Sometimes you high roll bleed. Sometimes on your S2 you high roll bleed and you get a +4 bleed count on one of the coins. Heck, you could gamble again and again, you get +12 bleed count, but I've never had that happen to me personally. And you might mention, I didn't mention a single bad thing about his identity. Because he is just that good. There's nothing really to complain about. His skills are just good. If anything, the only thing I complain about is his guard skill, which is a base of 10 and +4, which is horrible by the way. But it's Lust, so I'll give it a pass. And I keep mentioning Lust. Again, you'll see why Lust is so important later. And this idea is only amplified by his passive, which just gives him SP for free. Well, yeah, just for free, basically, because if you're in a bleed team, you're just gonna heal a lot of SP. That's kind of it for Ring Yi-sang. What more do you want me to say? I think that if you are a Limbus player who played before Ring Yi-sang launch and saw his release, you already know how strong this identity is, and I'm not even like playing it up. I'm not making this showboaty. I'm not exaggerating anything. He is just good, and that is a fact. I think anyone who says Ring Yi-sang has fell off or is bad is genuinely out of their mind. And yeah, that's all I have to say. So overall thoughts, the all-father of Bleed. I mentioned on the Manager Dawn slide, Ring Yi-sang is literally the godfather of Bleed. He is what made Bleed actually viable, because Bleed was run by so many like middle IDs. All these IDs have been shifted out, by the way. You don't see a single ID in old Bleed used anymore. It's all been replaced by newer IDs, and that just goes to show you how terrible Bleed was, at least before Ring Yi-sang and Season 7. Kanto 7. The only Bleed identity that... Actually, no, I'll keep that for later. And Bleed was just horrible. It was, I feel like it was like a 4 out of 10 status compared to every single other status. After Ring Yi-sang dropped, and along with his other identity, alongside him, he made Bleed like, okay, this is actually playable now. I can actually play this into bosses. This isn't just a status that can only work against single target low coin bosses. This is a status that can actually work outside of those niche scenarios. This is a status that can be consistent. After Ring Yi-sang dropped, the consistency of Bleed went through the roof here. And although he might be RNG, he still inflicts a ton of bleed count. S3, S2 has acceptable amounts of bleed count, especially with the gambling. At some point, you're gonna have situations where he actually gives you the bleed, and that's gonna be extremely helpful, especially when it's +3 count, +2 count. +3 count, +3 count on both S2 and S3. Randomly on the S2, randomly on the S2, you might get 6, maybe 9, maybe 12. It's insane. In most of my playthroughs with my Bleed team, and I'm a one-trick Bleed player by the way, I play Bleed on every single type of content, MD and story, every single time I use Bleed. He is most likely to get number 1 on your damage stats unless he dies early. Most of the time he's going to be top 2 or top 3, depending on what ID you really focused on. Manager Dawn could have like top 1 in chain battles, top 1 depending on if there's multiple body parts, top 1 depending on whether or not you can maintain bleed without using her counter because she does more damage without the counter, blah blah blah. But overall, Ring Yi-sang is an extremely consistent identity that is always going to be on top of your leaderboard. And being a Yi-sang identity, he has access to some of very, very good egos, very, very good supporting egos that I will mention later. He has very, very good SP heal alongside an ego that I will talk about later. Something I want to actually mention is that whenever Ringy Sang dies in a bleed team, you can really feel a lot of DPS loss. Whenever Ringy Sang dies, you notice that you aren't dealing as much burst as usual. When you're fully stacked on bleed, you can probably deal like 200 to 300 damage a turn. And without Ringy Sang, that goes down to like 150, 200 on a consistent amount, especially with a bleed stack. And even with a bleed stack, you can definitely feel the DPS loss from Ringy Sang because he literally deals like 80 damage every single turn by himself, and that's insane. And I'm not even counting for bleed here. Overall, extremely powerful identity, good stun affinities. He changed bleed for the better, and ever since Ringy-san got released, bleed got even better and better. I'm saying this as someone who played bleed from the beginning. I was playing Poise and I transitioned to bleed, and I played bleed before Ringy-san was released. I will tell you, it is miserable to play bleed back then. It was miserable. You didn't even focus on the status. It was so hard to make the status work because you barely had identities that were even good for it, and you barely had any identities that would actually capitalize off of the bleed. After Ringy's song, everything was so much better. Just from his inclusion in bleed, bleed was entirely flipped on his head, and ever since then, it's only gotten better. Also, he's my favorite identity in the game.
A plus.
The other identity that doesn't get as much credit, Ring Otis. Ring Otis is an identity that was released alongside Ring Isang, and I feel like recently, as the times changed, people forgot how good Ring Otis is. Like, people, like, when you point out bleed, she's kind of just pushed around and she's put on the sidelines in terms of discussion. But although she is like the lamest identity on the lamest center ever, in my opinion, she is amazing for the bleed team. She is a keystone. She is that secret gnome working in the secret hotel in the forest. She is running all of the things behind the strings. Well, not that serious. She is, let's say, like having like 25% of the strings. So, Ring Otis is an identity. No shit. But she has an S1 Lust skill, which is decently rolling, no comment there. S2 is where things get interesting. S2 can inflict around 5 bleed count. Why is that the case? She has the same reuse conditionals as Ringy Sang, and I explained earlier how it is extremely easy to pocket, especially when you have bleed that counts towards the percentage, which is already a free 60% chance, plus a couple of the status inflictions that Ringy Sang or Ring Otis herself can do, which can bump it up to like 80%, 100%, depending on what statuses you got. And it can get to 100% very easily with another identity I will be talking about later. One identity that is already also helping Ringy Sang that I mentioned earlier, that I am foreshadowing earlier as well. So, and this identity is, instead of having a high rolling skill like Ringy Sang, this identity instead has a 21 rolling skill. Pretty much equal to some of the max skill tree conditionals of some older identities, and that being on an S2, on a 2-star identity, that is extremely good. Plus 5 bleed count. The Manager Dawn's S3 Enhanced does plus 4 bleed count. Priest Gregor's S3 does plus 2 bleed count. Ring Isang can inflict plus 3 bleed count on base without RNG, with a potential of 6, 9, and 12. Ring Otis is the identity with the most bleed count. 100%. If you ever played bleed and you have Ring Otis, you will notice that whenever you start a stack, Ring Otis is there to lengthen it by like 2 entire turns. Or she's the one starting it in the first place. She is the best at bleed count in a bleed team because the S2 is so accessible and you can save it so much that you can have like 2 S2s coming in 2 times in a row to have plus 10 bleed count over 2 turns. She is amazing for maintaining and starting bleed count chains, and whenever you want to start a bleed count chain, you're always looking at Barbara Otis' skill set and seeing if she has skill 2. And if you don't have skill 2, it gets a little harder to make a bleed stack happen, but once you have a skill 2, your bleed stack is bound to happen at some point, because you can, even if you don't have the resources currently ready for it, and maybe you don't have the current skill cycle, maybe you don't maybe the enemy has too many coins, maybe it's not the right turn, maybe you don't have the right resources, then you can just save it for the next turn. Plus 5 bleed count in your pocket for free. And the good thing about this identity is that she is 3 to 6 speed. Instead of being an identity that rather starts a bleed count, yes, she does start a bleed count, but she starts it on the next turn. And that's very useful, because starting a bleed count on a turn, the same turn with fast speed, means that you're gonna have to be clashing with other skills. But because Ring Otis, the Ring Otis is quite slow, you can actually instead set up for the next turn, which is, in my opinion, a lot better for bleed, because it's just generally better. Plus 5 bleed count on the start means you can have other skills that are plus 2 bleed count, and you can keep maintaining that one. And instead of you having it on the start, instead you're setting it up, and you're not wasting a lot of like coin skill effects. And if you notice enemy skill cycle enough, you can also time her S2s. Next thing to talk about, her S3. Nothing special. All I have to mention is 1 haste, middling damage conditionals, and nothing else. Something I would like to mention is that sometimes you want to use her S3 on an enemy that's about to staggered or defeated, because she does give pierce damage up and pierce power up on your Ring Sang. And although that's not the biggest thing, it's quite nice, especially if your Ring Otis doesn't have much to do. Ring Otis, other than her plus 5 bleed count, she is a very unremarkable identity with not very high coin rolls, and she kinda sucks at clashing. The good thing, however, is she doesn't need to clash. If her on-hit effect was instead of heads hit, then that's gonna be pretty hard. But because it's not a heads hit, and it's on hit, it doesn't matter if this identity has SP or not. You can fucking leave this identity at 0 SP, and she's still gonna get value because all she does is plus 5 bleed count. And that's the wonderful thing about Ring Otis. Her only purpose is plus 5 bleed count, and that's amazing. She's, instead of a Swedish knife, she's just a straightforward knife. But it's a magical knife where you can only stab hamsters. I don't know where I'm going with this. Next, her passive. She inflicts 2 potency of a random effect out of the burn, bleed, rupture, tremor, sinking, and yeah, not that much to say about that. The best effects to get out of this is probably burn or rupture. I wouldn't say bleed, because bleed potency is a lot less relevant than bleed count, in my opinion at the very least. So it's not that good, but it's nice if you want your Ring Sang to inflict a couple of that. Reuse is more, especially when you're in a chain battle where you can't have a fully focused foreshadowed effect later, and you can't have that 100% conditional guarantee. Then it's pretty nice, especially when you give like, okay, 80% chance with bleed plus another status. So just pretty nice. The one thing that is abysmal about this identity is her guard skill. Her guard skill is a base of 4 with a plus 6 coin. That is absolutely horrid. Absolutely horrid. Most of the time you're not even going to be using the guard, because we already have an S1 lust anyway. But because we're in a bleed team, we accept any and all defense lust skills, and they all have a sometimes purpose. That's it for Barbara Otis. Sorry, okay, I mentioned her dead sister somewhere in there. That's it for Ring Otis. Next up, an ID that I think has been forgotten by the community of Bleed, and I don't know why, but they put her on the support passive bench when she is so much better on the field. It is just saddening to see her be put on the support passive bench instead of being actually on the field, because people just don't understand what this identity can bring to a Bleed team.
망치를 쥐고.
Cromer. I feel like a lot of Bleed players would be surprised with the presence of Encore Cromer in this video, because I think after specifically the Kurokumo IDs were released, people just started putting them in, and I feel like they forgot how crucial Encore Cromer is. Like, okay, I go to say like YouTube, I look up bleed teams, right? And I see that people don't really run Anchor Chroma anymore. They don't run Ring Otis. They don't run they don't run these two identities. And that really confused me because these are your primary sources of bleed count. What's the point of having identities like the Kurokumo that have S3 lust skills and they gain mediocre benefits from 3 lust resonance when you have this guy instead? And I feel like when you're running Kurokumo, you don't have enough bleed count to sustain your bleed stack. I just feel like it's so much less consistent than running Anchor Chroma. And speaking of consistency, this isn't a new concept, but Anchor Chroma really enables both the ring IDs. I've already seen people like talk about, oh wow, Anchor Chroma is really good with the ring IDs. It's like 100% guaranteed chance proc. People have already theory crafted this. I've seen SGU use like new Rhodia with them. In my opinion, that was an absolutely horrible take. But I do understand that because Bleed was absolutely horrible at the time before the Blood Fiends. So sure, you can put Ring Sang anywhere anyway. It was a generalist team, not a Bleed focused team, because Bleed focused teams are just terrible at that time. But people have theory crafted this, and people already know she's really good at Ring Sang, yet people don't run her anymore in Bleed. I don't get it. And I'll be justifying why. So Anchor Chroma, we've seen this stat line before. This is very reminiscent of Manager Dawn, 3 stagger thresholds, 47 speed range, with less defense level. So this ID is really very similar to Manager Dawn, but with a very different purpose. With Manager Dawn being a DPS, Anchor Chroma here is actually more of a support identity. She does not deal damage that much in most cases. She deals mediocre damage at most. But, unlike Manager Dawn, she has her own utility, a very important utility. The most important thing I want to talk about first is actually her passive. Whistles. At 4 lust resonance, at the start of the combat phase, heal 2 allies with lowest SP for 15 SP. 15 SP is equivalent to like 15 SP for 2 allies is like 30 SP total. And that's like 3 clashes, but for 2 allies specifically, so let's just say 1.5 clashes. SP generation is very powerful in any scenario, especially in 0 SP fights where you start on 0 SP. In story mode specifically, especially. It's not that helpful in MD, but because I'm speaking not in MD terms, but in story terms and general battle terms, Anchor Chroma's SP heal is extremely valuable. I've mentioned so much earlier, hey, this ID has a lust defense skill. Hey, this ID has a lot of lust. Hey, this ID has S2 lust. Hey, this ID has S1 lust. Well, all of that comes to enabling this identity to use her support passive. The main goal of Bleed, the main strength of Bleed, in my opinion, is how consistent it is. And people are just not using that consistency by running Kurokumo IDs. I see people run all the Blood Fiends, maybe a Ring Otis in there instead of Barbara Otis, with Ringy Sang, and then you have the two Kurokumo guys. That's horrible. Where is your consistency? Anchor Chroma is such a strong identity. Okay, Anchor Chroma has remained so relevant even until now because of her unique SP mechanics, and it still holds until now because we have never seen an ID that can give you so much SP in so fast of a time unless you are literally fueling Fluid Sac or Sun Shower in your first 3 or 2 turns. You have never seen an ID that can heal SP this fast and consistently. Especially in Bleed now, the fact that 3 of the Blood Fiends have 3 lust defense skill, although one of them you don't really want to use most of the time, Priest-Creator I'm talking about specifically, but you have other identities like Ring Otis with an S1 lust, you have S2 lust over here already, you have S2 lust on Ringy Sang. It's so consistent to get this SP healing every single turn, especially because of the defense skills, and yet people don't want to run her. I don't understand it. Okay, if you don't understand how strong this effect is, imagine you are winning clashes without winning them in the first place, and that is helping you win even more clashes. That's extremely strong. Winning clashes from not winning any clashes. This is passive SP heal that you are getting every single turn if you're focusing on it and if you're using it correctly. The next thing I want to talk about is identity, other than the very rapid SP heal that has already made her like very relevant until now, to the point where there are still some teams that use Lust Resonance just because of her on the bench now. If you don't know her bench effect, it's just the same thing, but instead it's for one ally. People put her on the bench for that, and sometimes if you have a team with a lot of lust, you put her on there, and she's actually pretty helpful there. But because her main ideal is that she heals 2 SP on field, people don't usually run her anymore because she's actually very weak if you're not running her in bleed, because all her support utility is just gone, and you'd rather just use her on support. But in bleed, you actually do want to run her because her utility is actually very useful. Now, why is that the case? The most important status to this identity that I want to talk about is Nails. Nails, if you don't know, is a status where at turn N, you halve this effect's count, rounded down, I believe, and you gain bleed by the stack you currently have. By X, yes, by the stack you currently have. So say you had 5 nails on a target, it would be rounded down at turn N, because you inflict on it at turn, right? At turn N it's gonna be halved and rounded down, so it becomes 2 now. Because 2.5 rounded down 2, and because it's 2 now, you gain 2 bleed count at turn N. Okay, that sounds alright. Now, and this identity inflicts this on every single skill she has, with S1 inflicting 1, S2 inflicting 5, and S3 inflicting 4 at heads hit. And another status I want to mention is Gaze, which is a status effect that gives you 20% fragile. Now, I mentioned this with a relatively toned down voice, and I didn't really emphasize on it. But if you've been paying attention with the other IDs that I mentioned earlier, the ring IDs, they have a 20% chance to proc, right? And bleed already counts as one of them, and you're probably gonna have bleed on them at all times, and it's gonna be very consistent to get bleed on them before you use your skills. So that's already a 60% chance. Without the randomness, and because the randomness procs later, you can't get the same randomness in the same turn, and it's just RNG dependent. Well, here's the solution to that. Nails and Gaze and Paralyze. Nails is another negative effect, and that boosts up to 80%. 80% plus any of the random statuses that you can inflict with Burn, Tremor, or whatever, and that is completely 100% consistent already. Okay, why is this the case? Because the status you want to get, the status you can inflict is Tremor or Burn. Those are the best statuses to inflict in order to have the proc relevant for the later turns, and you can keep them up especially. And why not Sinking or Rupture is because they just proc later after you hit them, and they just disappear, which is just bad for long-term procs. And because Chroma inflicts Nails, you could have the random effect from Rainy Song to inflict his S2 with random count for, in the best case scenario, Burn or Tremor. This way, you have a perfect 100% chance along with the nails that are going to be there permanently. Why do I say permanently? Because, you use one S2, right? You use one S2. Next turn is going to be 2 nails. Next turn is going to be 1 nail. And that just shows this status, nails, is never going to go away. It never is going to go away. Even at 1, all you have to do is inflict 1 more nails, and it lasts for another turn. Nails is a status that's never going to be off the enemy, especially when you are fighting a single target enemy. It's so useful. And even if you are facing a single target enemy, her SP heal in chain battles is amazing. You immediately get an advantage off the start, and you get even more advantage from winning more clashes with more percentage of winning those clashes with SP. She is amazing in this regard. Her entire other kit is mediocre at best. She doesn't have good coin rolls, but she doesn't need coin rolls, because all she has to do is go unopposed. You don't need to clash with this identity. Most people already say oh, she has terrible rolls, she has terrible clashing. Okay, because people are running this ID in teams that aren't utilizing bleed, so of course they would complain about that, and that's why she is relegated to the support bench when you are running IDs that have lust skills and that team can use lust skills. That's why she's relegated to the support bench, because she doesn't have good rolls and she can't clash properly. In a bleed team, that doesn't matter, because you have a dedicated team that can use Lust Resonance every single turn, 4 Lust Resonance every single turn, giving you SP, and Echo is gonna have high SP anyway, so she can clash with some smaller skills. And even then, you don't even need to clash with this identity, because she doesn't need to clash. All she needs to do is inflict nails. The only reason you want to clash with this identity and have high SP, have higher SP faster, is for his S3, because there's a heads hit inflict 2 nails conditional, and that gives you 1 additional bleed at turn end, which is pretty useful. But the main thing is, you just want the effect because you want to have the nails to confirm your other ring IDs so they can inflict even more bleed count. I mentioned earlier, Ring Otis's +5 bleed count, well, that gets even more consistent with his identity. Ring Isang's +3 bleed count, this gets 100% guaranteed because of this identity. And even if you don't get the head sit conditional on the S3, you're still having nails on that target. Nails is extremely hard to get rid of. In fact, I've never had a fight where nails wasn't on the target if they're single target, unless my Anchor Chromer is dead. Because even if she is staggered, she is going to be able to do it again next turn and it's still going to be there. It's insane. She is extremely, extremely strong. But that's all for a kid. And I do want to mention her stats. She is mostly the same stats as Manager Dawn with the same 47 speed. 47 speed doesn't really matter on this identity because you aren't inflicting bleed anyway, and nails is an entirely separate thing. So not exactly the most important thing. And well, 54 defense level, nah, it's a little lower. 3 stagger thresholds, quite a fragile identity. The last thing I want to talk about is identity is Gaze. Gaze is a status that gives you 20% more damage for every single blunt skill and pierce skill inflicted on the target. So practically too fragile for the entire team because the entire team I just showed you right now doesn't have a single slash skill. It doesn't have a single slash skill. So practically it's too fragile for the entire team, and too fragile, 20% damage. You already know how strong Force for the Flames is. Well, guess what? This is Force for the Flames consistent at a S2. And because of Gaze, you automatically get a 100% chance, even without nails. Why is that the case? Because from nails, plus 20% chance, from bleed, plus 20% chance, from gaze, plus 20% chance, 60% chance, from a 40% chance, into a 100% chance. 100% chance of reusing your coins. Just from this identity alone on her S2. S2 is by far the most important skill that she has, and S2 is the one that directly helps all of your ring IDs proc their skills. And I mentioned earlier, nails doesn't have particularly high bleed count, but end of turn bleed count has its own benefits, especially when you want to set up and your fantasy identity is one that has good bleed count. Well, guess what? This identity is going to help you set that up because she already inflicted like +2 bleed count, +3 bleed count, maybe +4 if you're lucky on the enemy on turn start. So this is a really good ID. If I hadn't like already showed you enough, this is the backbone of your team. The reason why bleed, in my opinion, is so strong, I mentioned this earlier already, is because it's so consistent. And why is it so consistent? It's because of Anchor Chromer. Anchor Chromer is what makes that team so consistent. Anchor Chromer is the fastest source of SP heal if your team has the right resources in Limbus Company. She is the fastest SP healer ever. And she has access to Fluid Sac. Goddamn. Another niche scenario that this identity is pretty good on is Chain Battles, or just focus battles with low HP targets. Because execution is quite the fastest SP heal, you're not going to see this happen very often, but when it does happen, it's quite useful. So, my finishing thoughts. She is the backbone of the Blue team. She is what makes that team consistent, and she is what makes people and she is what makes Bleed like powerful in the first place. I think people have been so blinded to like the power of the Blood Fiends and the power of Ringy-san that they forget that this identity is what makes them like so consistent and so strong in the first place, and they relegated her with Kurokumo IDs. I don't understand. Because she makes, okay, she gives you bleed count, she makes your other identities inflict even more bleed count, and she makes your Ringy-san do even more damage. I don't get why people don't want to run this identity. If you haven't noticed already, you are getting so much bleed count just from running this identity purely because her statuses help you inflict even more bleed count. +5 bleed count on Ring Otis, +3 bleed count on Ringy-san, and plus even more bleed count from her herself. That is an extremely high amount of bleed count that you're getting consistently at a high level. If you're not running her, you aren't going to be able to reuse your coins as consistently because you're gonna need to rely on Ring Isang to give you Tremor and Burn from his S2 multiple times just to keep that up and to have 100% chance guarantees. That's not consistent. If you're running Emperor Chromer, that all just becomes consistent. It all becomes easy. It all becomes easy to be consistent. It all becomes a 100% guaranteed chance. It all becomes SP. You're gonna roll SP. You win clashes everywhere. I don't understand why people have forgotten how strong Emperor Chromer is. I'm sorry for ranting, but it really is just the truth. Anchor Cromer is an extremely strong identity, and people have just forgotten that. Okay. She is the key to enabling both your ring students, and if you don't run her, you're missing out on a lot of value, especially in the early turns. Whereas for when you need to set up for like burn and trevor count, just from the ring IDs, just to get them to 100% chance, Anchor Chroma enables them potentially starting on turn 2. Because on turn 2 you get nails and you get the gaze, and even on turn 1 you can get an 80% chance. So again, a very strong identity that enables both your ring students, and being a fast identity, she has access to very, very good egos. Something I really want to complain about though is that she has extremely slow fucking animations. Like genuinely, if you ever ran this ID in like MD or just in story in general, you know how slow this identity is. Every time you clash, she is the last person to clash, and it is so painfully slow. And I miss Cromer, so I like running her. But that doesn't mean I'm biased, because this identity is literally really good for bleed. I don't understand. I don't get it. I don't get why people have just forgotten about her and how good she is. Anyways, I forgot to mention she has a lust defense skill as well. So if you're really desperate for lust resonance, there she is. 4+10, pretty decent evade actually. So yeah. Now, with all that discussion about IDs, and with all that tying into Ankle Cromer with her SP heal, the main point I drive home is consistency. The main points I drive home is how people have different utilities and how some IDs just don't work as properly because they don't make it consistent, and how all these identities tie into each other with their defense skills into an Echo Cromer that enables multiple of the IDs to be consistent with multiple roles such as tank, support, just status inflictors, DPS. Bleed teams has to have it all. So, what is my finishing team? With all this information said, I will give you my finishing team now and my personal team that I run. My personal teams for Bleed are the following. Usually, before the update on Kanto 7 and 8, you were only supposed to have 6 sinners, and if you're a new player, well, you'll be probably thinking, what? Of course, there's only 6 sinners. Well, if you already played this game to this update and to this Kanto, you'll realize that there's 7 slots now that you can use. But we'll be talking about the first 6 slots first. The first 6 slots are the IDs that I talked about earlier. You have Priest Gregor, Manager Dawn, the Princess Lamachla and Rodion, Enko Cromer, Ring Yisang, and Ring Otis. Now, you might be asking, what do you think for the 7th slot? Well, in my opinion, it's Red Eyes Ryoshu. And I feel like Red Eyes Ryoshu is an amazing pick because she has quite good sin affinities, and along with that, she has really good egos. Force of the Flames, along with Contempt of Ryoshu, which I'll be talking about later. Very, very good egos and very good sin affinities. If you don't know what Red Eyes Ryoshu does, basically she does good damage, she has good scaling, she is pretty tanky, she is a tank, a support, and a damage dealer all in one. She is a huge generalist, she benefits off of bleed by coin power, and she builds up this status that allows her to use a big S3, which is good for healing. So she's good for sustain, she's good for DPS, and she's good for tanking. Very good identity, and with a defense counter skill to top it all off, just to make things even more consistent for the team. However, I will want to say that a single body part boss, I would rather prefer using Arcorp Assault. Arcorp Assault is an ID that is just charge, and this ID, all it does is do bleed count. And that's kind of it. And you're already asking yourself, well, he only does bleed count. What's the point of bringing him in, even though we have so much bleed count in the first place? Well, it's a single body part boss specifically, and a single body part boss means Chains of Others. Chains of Others is an amazing ego that will allow you to set up a lot of bleed stacks very easily, and you're able to fuel it by turn 2. I actually beat a lot of bosses in the late game on Kanto 8 using this strategy, with Arkham Assault targeting specific skill cycles and specific times where the enemy is going to use like multiple coins, and this will allow you to actually win every single clash while allowing you to easily fuel your bleed stack and just getting SP for the entire team in general. So a very good identity. 5 bind as well, very good. You can manipulate your skills. You can easily make a bleed stack very, very easily. You can make sure you can set up a bleed stack. You can, because of 5 bind, you can set up your other skills to clash first, and then you use your other skills that you do bleed count unopposed, and that's going to allow you to build up for the next turn, etc, etc, etc. So in my opinion, our Corp Mirror Salt actually takes the cake over Ryoshu, mostly because he has Chains of Others, and he has very good skills for bleed count in general as well. And Mirror Salt is just pretty good. He also has another bleed to go that I'll be talking about later. However, because there is still the substitute mechanic that was introduced in Railway 4, if I remember correctly. The substitute mechanic is a mechanic, if you don't know it because you're a new player, it is a mechanic where if your center dies, another center is going to replace them. This way you can bring your entire bench on your team. Now, in my opinion, I actually don't really like this mechanic because I don't even use it in the first place, because I actually prefer using only 7 centers. But in a single body part boss, I do prefer adding Red Ice Yoshu on my 8th slot being your first substitute. I do not use other substitute slots because support passives are just that good, in my opinion, for bleed. So, and speaking of support passives, Middle Mirror Salt. Middle Mirror Salt is used if you are not fighting a single body part boss. Basically, support passive is if you have 3 NV owned, if I remember correctly, he heals 10 SP for allies on the same faction. And if you see, look at our team, we have a lot of IDs on the same faction. You have the rings and you have the blood fiends. So a lot of value there already. Very good early turn SP generation alongside Anchor Frost. Even faster SP generation. Another thing I want to mention is Kurokumo Ryoshu, which just gives you +1 more bleed. That is if you don't have Walpurgis. If you are a new player and you don't have access to Walpurgis, but you somehow unlock Kurokumo Ryoshu and you're looking for a bleed team, well, you can use it for your support passive. You have Kuroko Ishmael, in my opinion, one of the most important bleed passives. And because she's one of the most important bleed passives, I will slow down. Her passive is the following. Tree Lust own at Tree Lust Resonance, right? Tree Lust Resonance. You're already doing a lot of resonance with Encore Cromer. At Tree Lust Resonance, your fastest ally does +1 bleed and +1 bleed count with their skills. +1 bleed count with their skills. And the funny thing is, this applies like multiple times on IDs where the bleed proc are separate. Okay, I mentioned earlier Ringy Sang, right? Ringy Sang is a very speedy ID, 47 speed, so he's probably gonna be speedy once in a while, right? Yeah, unless you're in like late game and Manager Dawn is at her entirely part blood and she's maintaining it very well, right? You have Ringy Sang, fastest ID on the board. You activate Kurokumo Ishimon's passive along with Encore Kuro's passive for less resonance, along with the 3 less resonance required for the Kurokumo Ishimon passive. And if you remember, Isang S2, a lust skill, inflicts +1 bleed count on hit. If you have Kurokumo Ishmael on the board, it becomes +2 bleed. And that +2 bleed is repeated 2 more times into 6 bleed count. That is very strong if you couldn't tell already, and this applies to all your other IDs as well. Princess Rodion, Manager Dawn, even if she has more so potency rather than bleed count, sometimes it's going to be helpful in your S3 enhance. You have Priest Checker, but it's not going to happen often. You have Ring Otis sometimes. Very, very rarely Ring Otis. Very, very rarely Ring Otis. And one of my personal favorites, Arcop Mirror Salt, because Arcop Mirror Salt has a skill on his S3, which is a lust skill, and he spends a total of 10 charge to use it, but he inflicts +1 bleed count on 6 separate occasions. So potentially you're actually able to get +12 bleed count off of Arcop Mirror Salt, and Arcop Mirror Salt actually has speed up passives on his kit, but it's never really going to go true because his passive is just that terrible. You are never going to have that, and it's too much envy to get, at least in my opinion, unless you are repeatedly using the S1 of Walpurgis, Red Ice Yoshu, and even then it's just not really worth it to keep that much charge, and it's better just go for the S3. I have only had one occasion where this has happened, and it was huge, tremendous. +12 bleed count, if you didn't know, is amazing. Next up, for the fillers, aka IDs that where you don't have my personal ideal team. Some IDs that I actually think that are pretty okay to use are Hook Honglu, a 2-star Walpurgis ID, very cheap to start if you want him, and very easy to get as well. Basically an ID that has decent bleed count, okay, a Wrath skill on S1, which is very important to note. Pride skill, just an okay identity, not much to talk about. S2 is sometimes pretty good. I use it for Kanto 8, which if you don't know is Kanto 8 Honglu's Kanto, and I used it for Honglu's Kanto, and it was pretty okay. Next is Kurokumo Ryoshu, which I mentioned earlier. Kurokumo Ryoshu has pretty decent bleed count on both her S2 and S3, and S1 has really good paralyze. Not much to say other than that, just an okay filler identity if you don't have any other identities if you don't have any other identities. Next is Captain Ishmael. Captain Ishmael, I recommend only using if you don't have Kuroko Ishmael, and if you don't have an ID that is on my personal team. She's good. She's okay because, you know, just using it S1 is pretty nice. Other than that, Luster Dance is pretty easy to activate her S2, and she has an NV skill 1 and a RAF skill 3, which is pretty okay. She is a fake bleed identity. She does not inflict that much bleed, but I do want to note that she inflicts burn. So if you have a ring identity, it's gonna be a little bit more consistent because she's gonna inflict burn with her overheat gas harpoon, and that's kind of it. Next is Anchor Sinclair. I know a lot of players have been recommended to shard Anchor Sinclair, and I believe that is the right play. I do not recommend sharding Anchor Cromer, at least in my opinion, unless you want to have a really weak early game, because Anchor Sinclair really breezes through until like Canto 6, in my opinion, and that's going to get you through a lot of content. And Anchor Sinclair is usually going to be, and Anchor Sinclair Thursday is a pretty good identity. But the thing is, if you have Anchor Cromer, please do not run Anchor Sinclair. I've tried it myself. He is not good. I've tried substituting him as 8 slot / 9 slot, but it doesn't work out because Anchor Cromer is always there to heal him, along with Middle Mere Salt. So it's just very hard to get him up and running if you have Anchor Cromer. But if you don't have Anchor Cromer, he's a very good addition to your team. Next is Pequod Harpooner Heathcliff. I mentioned him earlier in the pre-sticker section. He is an okay tank. He is a fake lead identity. He does not crit often. And anyone who says otherwise is just stupid. What's the point of bringing an ID that doesn't do anything for like 6 turns until you actually stack him up? And even then, you don't even really want to be using his S1 damage for +4 count. It's just a very awkward identity to use in general. I don't really like using this identity, but I did use this identity when I didn't have enough shards to get a blood fee in. At that time, I was trying to shard Princess Rhoda, if I remember correctly, and I didn't have the amount of resources for that. So I was waiting. So I was just using Pequod Heathcliff in place of that, and he's an okay tank, definitely, but he's not going to be doing much other than just being a generally okay identity. So yeah. And if you have any other generalist IDs, they also take 4 fillers. I mentioned some generalist IDs such as Chink Sinclair, just okay general identities. I don't know. Name any random generalist ID, and it's probably gonna be able to fit into any team, and it's gonna be fit just into bleed as well if you don't have a specific this specific bleed loadout. So that is my personal team. I'm sure some of you will disagree, and I'm glad to hear your thoughts later. Seriously, put down your thoughts. I'm glad to discuss about Bleed because I'm very passionate about this, and this is the team I've been using to clear all story content. I only use Bleed for story content, and I use nothing else. And I always use Bleed for MD. I always use Bleed for my XP Luxurvations. I always use Bleed for my Trade Luxurvations. I use Bleed for Railway. I use Bleed for practically everything. So I'm more than happy to discuss about Bleed, and I'm happy to hear other people's opinions. I hope my explanation for the IDs that earlier have helped solidify, in my opinion, in their placement in this team. And I hope that I was able to convince you guys that this team is actually pretty good, because it is the team I'm running, and if it's not well received, well, I'd be quite sad. So, onwards. Other than identities, sinners have other things to do, and that is egos. So, this chapter 3 is going to be a quick ego rundown, because I don't think I need to really discuss the egos too in depth. If you want to know more about the egos, just Google them online. Go to wiki.gg, do not go to wiki fandom, and just check them out. And without further ado, just a quick ego rundown. But before that, I do want to point out some symbols that I'll be using. I am categorizing these 3 egos into meh, nice, and amazing, with meh being a small bonus, or I might have some really niche uses. It is okay to have, definitely not a bad thing, but it's just very niche, and it might cost too much, it might be too niche, it might be just a little below average. That is the mid tier. Nice is going to be a pretty good ego. It has a good bonus. Maybe it might just be like personalized to that specific ID. It's not really contributing to the status. It is a pretty useful ego, but it's not going to be fully game changing. Amazing are egos that I think are amazing, and I still don't think you should shard egos. But if you do want to shard an ego, these are probably the egos you want to be looking for, especially if you're running bleed. These are game-changing egos that extremely boost the team's potential, maybe in the status, or just very, very good egos that help the entire team with SP generation, healing, etc, etc, etc. And usually you're going to be farming your synergies exactly for this ego. So, first up on the list of egos that I do want to talk about, first up we have Priest Yeager and Princess Rodion. Actually, no. 3, 2, 1. First up on the list of egos I do want to discuss is Priest Yeager of La Mancha Land and Princess Rodion. And these are the egos that I usually like to recommend to other people, and some of the egos that are pretty relevant to the status. First of all, we have Legerdemain from Gregor, a Zany ego, which if you don't know what it does, is a gluttony ego, quite cheap, and it does paralyze most of the time, unless you are at uptide 3, which is going to be on heads hit, but if you're at uptide 4, it's going to be on hit, which is really, really good. Uptide 4 Legerdemain is definitely pretty worth it, and its passive is that you get to inflict maggots at a very unlikely chance. I personally have only gotten maggots like only a handful of times, 2 or 3 times, so the maggots thing isn't that huge. But the one thing I do really like about this ego is that it is gluttony, and it's only like 3 resources if I remember correctly. And that means you're going to be able to spam this ego a lot, especially when you have Sloth, which is one of its components for using the ego on Manager Dawn. It's a very strong ego that's going to help with clashing very big skills. And it's 3 attack weight, 4 paralyze, quite useful. But not that all that game changing. It's definitely just a good ego to use in a majority of situations, but not that huge to the status. I do recommend charting it though, because it is just an amazing ego that I always use in most of my fights. Next up we have Lantern Gregor, an ego that I personally don't have because I'm not willing to shard it or roll for it. Lantern Gregor is basically an ego that has on-hit heal, and that's all it does. Its passive is irrelevant, all it does is to do on-hit heal. Now why did I even put this on the list if that's the case? Well, on-hit heal is quite useful, especially on Priest Gregor, because the sustain is amazing. The cost resources are okay, but overall you're not going to really be using this ego often, especially if you are experienced with bleed. Most of the time you aren't going to have Priest Gregor on that low of an HP, especially if you are able to manage your resources for healing egos and using your skills properly and using his S3 properly. You're never going to really see Priest Gregor this low unless, you know, he just got hit by this enemy's strongest attack. I've personally never been in a situation where Priest Gregor is even close to death. And it's either because the limbus company is too easy of a game, or the enemies are just not strong enough yet. But I've personally never been in a situation where Priest Gregor needed a lot of support. He at best he like reached 1 HP and then he's regened all the way up just from a single S3. So not really a lot of situations where you really want to use Lantern Gregor unless you just want a couple more damage. Overall, not a very important ego, but I do want to mention it because some people use it as a safety net for Priest Gregor, especially if you are not experienced. It's quite okay to have. Next up is God on Thor's Gregor. God on Thor's Gregor is personally one of my favorite egos in the game. It is basically an ego in a bleed team. It's basically an ego where you need to have 6 Lust Resonance because it gives you Lust power up and Lust damage up. Extremely good ego, and one of the best things about this ego is actually healing. A lot of people really underestimate the healing of this ego. It's actually better than Fluid Sack because specifically it heals 4 allies for I think around 33% HP, somewhere around that much, and it's actually really good for healing. One thing I actually want to point out is a lot of people really say that this ego is really expensive, but the funny thing is because Bleed is so good at fueling every single synergy, especially if you have a certain ego later, you're going to be able to have Guardian of Thorns Gregor like very fast. Like I'm talking like turn 4, turn 5, and that's extremely good for a healing ego. Fluid Sack is quite hard to have because you need to have like Ryoshu S2s, you need to have situations where you actually want to use Isang S1s, especially when you are ignoring 4 Lust Resonance, you're not going to get a lot of value, and usually you're going to have synergies later. But because Guardian of Thorns is so cheap, 2/2 for every single each affinity, it's actually quite cheap to have, and you actually get it pretty fast, surprisingly. It's also just a generally good 7 attack weight ego with good healing and just good buffs in general. In my opinion, one of the very top egos you get for a bleed team and for your other teams that run Gregor. Just overall a very useful healing ego and a very useful bleed ego. Also, I'm talking about 6 Lust Resonance specifically because if you have 6 Lust Resonance, the effects that he gives to your allies are going to be transferred to your next turn. Please note that this has to be absolute resonance, and it's actually quite useful because then you can set up for next turn, and we know how strong next turn fragile is compared to same turn fragile. You need to have speed ranges and stuff, and because Priest Gregor doesn't have the best speed range, you're not going to be using the buff too often. If you are at like 5 resonance, you're not going to have the buff. You're going to have it for only a handful of allies, maybe 2 or 3 max below you, below Priest Gregor speed, and that's not very good. So using 6 resonance is going to be really good, especially when you are setting up for a nuke turn. Even if you only have like 2 lust skills, it's very much worth it. Just our overall good ego. Next up we have Prism Launch and Rodion's egos. First on the list we have Hexnail. In my opinion, there's a lot of better options for healing egos, because Hexnail, although it does heal, I wouldn't really use it that often because there are just other better healing egos. But it's definitely not bad to have. I personally wouldn't shard this, but if you do, you've had it from a BP, that's great. It's a healing ego that has nails, and it gives you more bleed potency. It's a good ego, definitely, but it's kind of just like equal to Pursuance, at least in my opinion. Not that much of a difference. You inflict more bleed potency, sure, you do more healing, you have nails, but I wouldn't say it's like a huge game changer. You can definitely live without it. I'm just saying that like the envy cost, to me at least, is just a bit too much, and I find that it actually deactivates some passive sometimes, and it's quite hard to get back. Even when the ego itself is envy, it's actually quite hard back. It's actually quite hard to get envy back, especially when you only have basically one ID with a S1 envy skill, which is, by the way, Red Eyes Yoshu or Arc Corrupting Assault. It's quite hard to get this off. It's okay when you get it off. It's definitely a benefit, but I wouldn't say it's game changing. I wouldn't say I use it for every single time, because it's actually quite hard to feel it in the first place. Next up we have Pursuance Rodion. Basically the same role as Hexnail, just a healing ego, except there's no debuffs. The one thing that's holding this ego back for me is the Sloth cost. Sloth is, although found in Manager Dawn, you're not really going to be seeing this until like turn 6, turn 7, when you're actually using her S1s, when you have the cycle complete, and you're cycling through your S2s, you're cycling through your S1s, you're cycling through your S3s. Before you get to that point, at like 15 plus hard blood every single turn, before you get to that point, you're not really going to have Sloth, and there's just better healing egos out there. I will definitely say that sometimes I do use it, considering that I do use Pursuance Assault sometimes. It's definitely there situationally, but I wouldn't say I focus on fueling it unless I'm really desperate. Similar to Pursuance Assault, I wouldn't really focus on fueling it until I'm really desperate, because there are 2 other healing egos that are better. One healing ego that was better, I already mentioned, Garnet Franz Gregor, an extremely good ego. So just these healing egos from Rodion, like the synergies they have are what's holding them back from me giving them like a very good rating, because I don't really see myself using them too often, and other healing egos are just better for setup, they're just better for fueling, they're just better in general, and I don't see these 2 as giving that big of a bonus, especially when you have very good competition in the egos that bleed teams have. Next up, one of the most important bleed egos, at least in my opinion. I always forget this ego's name. I always say Roseate Desire Rodion, and I'm just stupid because that's not the name of it. It's actually Red Shoe. I'll just call it Red Shoe Rodion. Red Shoes Rodion is one of the most important bleed egos like ever released. I'm speaking like very nonchalantly, but it's actually one of the most important egos for bleed. When it released, I believe it was like around the time of Ringy Song. Actually, I think it was before Ringy Song. Back then, Rodion had no bleed identities, and the only bleed identity was actually Kurokuma Rodion, and Kurokuma Rodion was absolutely terrible to run in bleed. I actually got the ego, but because there was just really bad bleed identities at the time, and Princess Rodion didn't exist, I had no Rodion ID to put this on, and the bleed team was just really weak. So this was sitting on the backbench for a while, until Princess Rodion came. Princess Rodion perfectly fuels the synergies this ego needs, with Pride, Lust, and Envy. They're all needed for this ego. One thing that she doesn't feel is Wrath, but because Dawn and Ring Otis has Wrath, it's quite fulfilled pretty much most of the time, and especially when this ego is going to be used in later turns. Now the question is, what is the ego even used for? This is a WoW ego, and what it does is basically the most important line of text. Combat start, the target of this ego does not lose bleed count for the turn at all. So if you proc bleed count 3 times, you expect it to reduce bleed count by 3, but because you use this ego at the start of the round, you actually don't even consume any bleed count. A very strong effect if you couldn't tell. If you're fighting an enemy with like 6 skill slots, say a certain enemy in Kanto 8, a certain someone who does like 5 coins a turn. When you have an actual bleed stack going and you use this ego, doesn't matter if you have like 20 coins, it's gonna be proccing every single time, and your bleed stack stays the exact same. So you basically get an extra turn of setting up while also getting the value. That's ridiculous, especially when that value is getting transferred to Blood Feast for even more value. That's insane. This is an extremely important ego to bleed. The rest of the thing this ego does is deal true damage based on Lust Resonance, based on bleed. I don't really focus on using that for the effect of that, but sometimes when you're like using a huge ego turn, Conference Rigger and Red Shoes Rodion plus some other Lust ego, Miracala Assault, Miracala Dawn. Unless it's those kinds of turns, I don't really focus on that. I mostly just focus on the line of combat start. The target of this ego does not lose bleed count at all. So, next up, we have Manager Dawn. Now, although I wouldn't really talk about base egos, I feel like this deserves a mention. Base egos, I feel like everyone knows that Dawn basically just heals on hit and inflicts a ton of bleed potency, and the passive is on hit heal 3 HP if the target has bleed. The reason I'm putting this ego on here anyway is because it actually really helps Manager Dawn sustain a lot. When Manager Dawn is staggered, she's on like 90 HP-ish. You use this ego, you get to 110, and now permanently you have a skill that gives you 3 HP on hit every single time. And because her in-hand skills get even more coins, this is actually quite strong in proccing, and actually procs very often. Her S2, because it has AoE, you can actually heal a lot off of it. You actually heal if you have the full conditional of 2 attack weight, which becomes 20 bleed, 20 heart blood, which unlocks a threshold of 3 attack weight. You actually heal a total of 18 HP, and that's a lot, especially for free healing every single turn. This also can be used in like staggered enemies. You heal a bunch off of this. This is actually pretty useful for even giving bleed potency if you don't have any options. Like if your entire bench is on S2, if your entire skill bench is only S2s and you want bleed potency, this is definitely a good option for that. And generally, yeah, it's just a really good sustain ego, and Manager Dawn really could use that because she's actually quite fragile. And using these egos, she actually gets back up to relatively very fast HPs, relatively safe HPs, very fast, especially when combined with her innate passive healing already on all her skills. Next up, we have Wishing Current Dawn. In my opinion, a very good ego. Wishing Current Dawn is something I use quite often, especially on later turns when I'm actually using Sloth instead of Lust for Lust Resonance. And what it does is basically +4 bleed count and paralyze on heads hit. The +4 bleed count is unconditional. I mostly use this because of the bleed count. The bleed count is really useful, especially on an ID with no bleed count in the first place, other than on the S3, and having an ego that inflicts the same amount of bleed count as the S3 is actually very useful. I sometimes find the paralyze to be useful, but I don't see it as useful as the legendary Gregor. Although she is very fast, I don't really see myself using it because, at least in Gregor's case, it's really spammable. But in this case, the paralyze is a bit lower, and I don't really spam this ego because it's actually really hard to get the resources back for it. So it's kind of like a one-time use. But that one-time use is very useful, especially for setting up turns where you want to have a bleed stack and maintain it. Having a +4 bleed count on demand ego is definitely worth a shot if you have it. This is actually, fun fact, my first ever ego, and I remember using it very fondly in Kanto 4, even though I had no bleed team. A very cool ego. Very useful for only maintaining bleed count and nothing else. The damage is okay, but nothing to be remarkable. Nothing remarkable to speak of, just the average damage that any other ego does. Next up, we have Miracala Dawn. Miracala Dawn, if you don't know, is just a huge attack weight ego that does damage based on Blood Feast and bleed. That has more coin power based on bleed on target, and she inflicts like this true damage status thing at the end, but it's not that important because it's capped at 30, which is absolutely horrible. So it does a total of like 120 true damage over the course of 4 turns. So basically just your average bleed stack at late game, but a bit worse. I don't have this ego, and I don't see myself using it often. I spectated my friend using who has the Miracala Ego and the Battle Pass of Canto 7, but you really don't use this ego often. Like, especially on single target bosses, you're not going to be using this ego. Like, using any other skill is just better because you're saving resources, and the passive for this ego specifically is just not useful, especially when you're running my team that has very accelerated SP heal. You have no use for the 1 SP heal for every time bleed is triggered. 1 SP heal, by the way, Kim Ji-hoon, at least give her an actual good passive. But anyways, overall this ego is just, I don't see myself using it. I've said, I know like the damage potential of the whole thing, but be for all of me, there's just like, in what situation are you getting like that much value off of it? Especially when it's based on Blood Feast, which means late game. Based on the Blood Feast, based on Bleed on Target, which is impossible to stack in chain battles. Like, you're not going to be using this ego very often. Like, even in chain battles, you're not going to get the full conditionals. It's very hard to get it fully up and running. And in single target bosses where you are getting the most Blood Feast, this is even good to use. It's not going to be doing much anyway, because, you know, it's a single target boss. I know it does like okay 100 damage-ish, but your bleed stack already does more, and I feel like just maintaining that is better than trying to cash out on this ego, especially when there are other egos that use the resources that this ego has that are just usually better in most cases. I definitely do see use for it in bosses where they summon things, a certain boss in Canto 8 summoning a certain thing. I saw my friend use it there, and it was actually pretty useful because they were slash weak. But in any other situation, I don't really see myself using this ego often. Even if I don't have it, I can see theoretically that like usually I go to my battles, and fun fact, I actually check Miracle Dawn sometimes, and I see, oh, I have enough resources for this, but I don't really see myself using this anyway. And I just see myself using another ego that's just better. So Miracle Dawn, although it has like very niche uses and is very very good in MD for clearing stages and bleed teams, in story battles, I don't see it being all too useful. So we can see here, Manager Dawn's egos are not that important. They're mostly just selfish, not really selfish, just okay self buffs, with S1 being for healing, S2 being for maintaining bleed count, which is actually pretty useful, but not a huge game changer because it's not spammable and it's quite hard to fuel, and S3 being an occasional really good wave clear, especially in MT if you're farming. Next up, Ringi-sang, the Great Prince. Ringi-sang has pretty good egos. I'd say he has pretty useful egos. First of all, I want to talk about Wishing Karan Isang. Wishing Karan Isang is similar to Wishing Karan Dawn, which is the inflicts paralyze, but unlike Wishing Karan Dawn, it has no status effects. The reason I'm putting this here is because of the blood protection it gives. A lot of blood protection, which is 3 blood protection every single turn and 3 sloth protection every single turn, which is just pretty good. Yeah, what can I say? Negative minus 30% more damage on your ally, on your Ring-sang, especially on blunt skills. Pretty useful. The paralyze sometimes comes in handy as well, and if you apply it to 4, there's attack weight. I personally have it applied 4 because I just like the design of the ego. Do not copy me. But generally, you're not going to be using this ego that much. It's not that useful. The paralyze sometimes comes in handy, but the ego cost is too much sometimes, and you just have other egos that are better at using it. And speaking of other egos that are better at using it, also that's it for the Wishing Karan discussion. It's not that much to talk about. Speaking of another ego that actually uses Sloth a lot better, Sunshower Isang, which is the WoW ego over there on the right. Sunshower Isang is extremely good ego. It heals SP every single turn by 3, and it's just really good for AoE. And that's kind of it. It has 3 protection for the next turn for all of your allies, so it's very good for sustaining, very good protection, very good damage, like surprisingly if you land hit, and the SP heal is definitely worth it. It accelerates the SP heal even faster. Now, even though you're gonna have like 40 SP-ish against enemies that drain your SP a little, say a certain lab coat man who drains your SP in the story battle, this is gonna be quite useful for that, especially against sinking enemies, etc. etc. So it's generally a very good thing. It also helps your other allies use egos more freely and less punishingly. You have Guardian Thronescragger that costs 30 SP. red ribbons, costing 10 SP per turn, all things like that, and other egos that just generally spend SP a lot. Those egos are going to be a lot less forgiving because you have 3 SP per turn, especially combined with the Encore Chroomer for Lost Resonance SP heal. Using egos in Bleed is really forgiving. Unlike other teams that don't really have SP heal that much, Bleed teams are really free to use SP heal to forgive any ego usage, and you're gonna keep being able to clash even the next turn because of the accelerate XP heal. Like even after you set 30 SP ego, you have the plus 15 from Chroma and you have the plus 5 from plus 3 from the Sun Shower. That's already 18 SP more. You're at like 28 SP. That's pretty damn decent. One clash and you're already at 38. So really good stuff. Next up, we have Wayward Passenger Isang. Most people say this is a really good ego because of the +1 rupture count for Isang. The funny thing is, I'm unable to confirm if it even like goes into the percentage count because it's an ego passive. By the way, if you don't know what it does, the ego passive is basically if Isang is faster than the target, you inflict +1 rupture count on hit, and that's kind of it. +1 rupture count on hit, if you don't know what that implies, is it's going to give you an additional status for Ring Isang to proc off of on his S2, and a little bit of help, just for Isang personally because it's only +1 rupture count. So basically, it confirms Ring Sang's reuse rate to 100%. At least that's what most people think. I personally can't tell if it even like applies to the percentage count anyway, because it's an ego passive, which is different from Kit, and because I already proc it every single time anyway. Like, I already have nails and other statuses. I don't really need this because my bleed team is really good at having 100% reuse already. So I don't see myself using this ego especially for that. But the good thing about this ego is that it costs, I believe, 3 sloth and 3 gluttony, 6 resources for this he ego. Quite cheap if you ask me. And the one thing about this ego that I really like, ignore that it's rupture based. The one thing I really like about this ego is that it's really high rolling. If I remember correctly, it rolls like around 38. I think it rolls like 38, 35, somewhere around that range, 32 to 38, 32 to 35, I think. And that's really damn high numbers. That is like an entire self-destructive purge with 0 head hits. That's very strong for clashing, especially on an ego that's really cheap to use, 6 resources. I see myself using this quite often, especially against skills that are really big against bosses in story, because it's just really damn high rolling and you get it pretty easily, especially in later turns. You get the Gluttony from Priest Gregor, you get the Sloth from Manager Dawn. In later turns, you have a really on-demand, high rolling skill. Pretty good. That's it for Ring Sang. One last thing I want to talk about actually is Fell Bullet Isang. Fell Bullet Isang takes the place of the He-Ego, meaning if you want to run it, you replace Wayward Passenger. The opportunity cost is definitely there. You are trading a high rolling ego for this one. So just keep that in mind. But what it does basically is shoot an ally, and if you shoot that ally, you get a huge AoE skill and you get ego resources. In my opinion, this is very conditional. I don't see myself using this often. Even on like allies that are like almost at death's door, you have so many healing egos at that point that they just kind of don't die. Like unless they get one shot, it's really hard to have an ID die in Bleed because everyone has passive healing and everyone is healing often with Fluid Sac and everything. With Fluid Sac, Garden Thorn Squigger, etc. By the way, I'm talking like this if you have like all these egos. If you don't have these egos, perfectly fine, don't worry. It's definitely still good for sustaining, but you're gonna have a little bit of a harder time. Don't worry about that. It's very possible to beat bosses even without healing egos. I beat the entirety of Kanto 7 without a single healing ego, and I beat Kanto 8 without using healing ego until like what? The mid boss. Actually no, not the mid boss, kind of the end mid boss and the end boss. So it's definitely possible to beat Limbus Company without any healing egos, but I'm just saying. Anyways, back to my main point. Fellblade Isang, I don't see myself using this too often because usually just heal back to reasonable amounts. Unless you get one shot completely, you don't really have situations where you really want to Fellblade Isang. I say this especially because I'm someone who uses support passives instead of using substitute IDs for my entire kit. So I really don't prefer dying. Like I only have one substitute, and that's Reliance Reassure or Arkham Assault. And even then, that's for like single target bosses. So I don't really use this ego often. I do have it, I just don't use it. I can definitely see arguments for it to be used. I just don't think it's worth like taking out a really cheap ego that's on demand, very high rolling, and beats a lot of things in the game for just like a very situational pick. So overall, I'm not giving it a rating because we'll see if it gets better later, and we'll see how the bleed team changes later. But in my opinion, I just don't see myself using it often. Egos I want to talk about, we have Ring Otis and Encore Cromer finishing out the Ring duo while adding Encore Cromer in. The last of the 6 identities that I am putting in my own personal team. This is the last batch of them. First, I want to talk about Ring Otis. One of the ego that I do really like for Ring Otis is Sunshower Otis. Sunshower Otis is a high rolling skill comparable to Wayward Passenger Isang. I just found out earlier, Wayward Passenger Isang rolls a total of 38, and if I remember correctly, Sunshower Otis rolls up to a 35 or 34, around those numbers. So it's a very high rolling skill comparable to Wayward Passenger, and just like Wayward Passenger, it beats a lot of skills in the game, especially really big ones. Even though they're slightly different from each other, the high rolling skills are enough to beat most of the skills in Limbus anyway. It's a very cheap ego as well, costing 5 resources. If I remember correctly, it is 1 Gloom, 2 Sloth, 2 Gluttony. Synergies that are pretty easy to find in Bleed Team, especially with S1 Gloom on Isang, S2 Sloth, S1 Sloth on Nitrodan, with Gluttony from Priest Rigger. These are S1 affinities that you can easily get if you are focusing on using your S1s to fuel your egos. If you're not focusing on the 4 Lust Resonance, especially in later turns, it's very easy to get this off, especially when most of the resources are on S1s. Overall, I don't think the rest of his kit is really that necessary to talk about. Like some bind, some poise count for herself, and a little bit of sinking and some tremor bursts, but these are mostly just not that important, especially when it's not like sinking count or tremor count, which can be used for reuses. It's just not that useful. The poise especially isn't that useful, especially for an ID that isn't known for the damage in the first place, but instead known for the stats effects. So yes, even though it's plus 7 poise count and like okay poise skin if she's staggered, it really isn't going to do much, especially when the ID isn't even used for damage in the first place. Overall, its only use is for a high rolling skill. Next we have Yasunyata Taprapam Otis. Hopefully I said that correctly. Yasunyata Taprapam, I'll just call it my form MT's Otis, is a decently okay rolling skill that's very easy to get online if you focus on fueling it. And what it does is just give you attack power up and less fragility on the opponent, and that's kind of it. It also just is a quote unquote free ego because it heals SP on herself, so it is spammable if you have the right resources. This is actually an ego that I sharded, but I only sharded because I really like the design of my form MTs. So I'm not saying you should like follow me, but I mostly just sharded this ego because I found it like really useful for turns where you just want an extra oomph rather than using the S1 of Otis, and you just want like this extra 1 attack power up. And sorry, not the 1 extra power up. It's the fragility that you mostly want. And in nuke turns where you're using Card of Thorns Gregor and you set up for the next turn, and you have less skills for the next turn, this is pretty useful for that, especially if your other allies that are going after Ring Otis. Ring Otis is like generally in the middle or the last. Yeah, honestly, it's not even that useful. I don't know if the shard was even that good. Again, I sharded for design. It is not that good. I don't recommend sharding it. I just get Suntower Otis. It has some really niche uses, like if she somehow goes pretty fast, the less fragility can be useful. But there's so many random factors, and the fact that she doesn't have haste, by the way, she only gives haste on her S3 to another ally, not to herself. It's just not that useful, especially when the haste she gives like makes it even harder for her to like have the stars align. Just not a generally good ego, but it's okay rolling. It's good to have. It's okay to have. You can feel it pretty easily, and it's quote unquote free with the SP heal. So not that good, not that bad. Next up we have Ebony Stem Otis. Ebony Stem Otis is an ego I really like on Otis. What it does is basically just have a really big AoE, and that's kind of it. It has a really big AoE, some Gluttony Fragility, and some Bleed, but that doesn't really matter unless you're an MD, because MD is going to count this as a Bleed ego, even though it's not necessarily good for Bleed. It counts as a Bleed ego, and so it does more damage. But other than in MD and story modes, the bleed and the status infliction doesn't matter at all. What it does, however, is the passive that's important. On hits hit with a coin, inflict +1 object count next turn, which is not relevant to right now, to discussion right now. But what is relevant is the bind inflicts. On hits hit with a coin, inflict 1 bind next turn. This 1 bind next turn is pretty useful. On heads hit means there's no cap, so her S1 will inflict 2 bind, her S2 will inflict 4 bind because of reuse, and her S3 will inflict 2 bind. What I'm focusing on is the S2 bind. The S2 bind is really helpful. That is 4 bind. That is practically a chains of others on your S2. That is going to be really consistent. This is a really consistent way of having speed puppeteering. It is really useful against single target bosses. I found this really useful against a certain boss that gains debuffs from bind in a certain mid boss of a Kanto. Really useful for that. The fueling, however, is quite hard because you need 4 Gluttony, and that you're not gonna really have that from the Gregor. But once you do have it, that is an immense bonus. That is a 100% guarantee for the rest of the fight. For the reuses from the Ring Otis and Ring Isang, the rest of the fight they're gonna be 100% guaranteed most of the time, even if there's no nails, even though there's no status on them. The bind, bleed, and the nails is just 100% guarantee for the rest of the entire fight. In my opinion, better than Wayward Passenger guarantees. If it does even guarantee, I mentioned earlier, but not important right now. The 1 bind is really extremely helpful, especially when you know how important speed is for bleed. I've said this countless times, how important having high speed, having low speed for enemies is very important for bleed, because you want to puppeteer these clashes so that you can have your bleed count in the ideal spot, in the most ideal spot possible. So I really do like Ebony Stem Otis. This is an ego I sharded after I got most of my bleed identities up and running. This is one of the first few egos I sharded after Sun Shower and Fluid Sack, and I don't regret a single thing. Once you get it up and going, it is definitely very useful. So although not a huge bleed buffer, indirectly through a true bind, it is very useful for bleed. Next up, we have Incorp Cromer. Incorp Cromer has 2 egos I want to talk about. Foss doesn't exactly have the best egos, but because of this one singular ego, she's just extremely good. So Hexnail Foss. Hexnail Foss is a 6 NV, yeah, it costs 6 NV, only NV, and what it does is it inflicts nails at up by 4. I don't have it on up by 4, I have it on up by 3, because I don't think it's that worth it, especially when your other skills already inflict nails. This is just adding more things that is not really needed. But the main thing of this skill that I want to talk about is none of the effects really. The effects are really good, definitely. Like 3 Pierce Fragility, if I remember correctly. 3 Pierce Fragility for a team that has majority Pierce is pretty good. But other than that, it's kind of hard to get up and running until you have a 7 slot in Kanto 7 to Kanto 8 with Red Eyes Ryoshu or Arc Up Your Salt. You're not going to have this ego that often before that. But once you have 7 Sinners, it actually does get online pretty regularly, unlike turn 4, turn 5, after you do your Lost Resonance activities. It is really useful in a pinch when you don't have any other options and you just want to use an ego that's decently clashing. It's very useful for that. I've had situations where I just had nothing to have because I didn't fuel properly, but because most of the egos in bleed teams don't really use Envy, their Envy affinities are just going to be sitting there doing nothing, and you can actually spam this for like 3 or 2 turns, and it's actually pretty decent at that. With an 18 base, that's like okay enough to beat like some quote-unquote S2s of bosses. Not big enough to clash huge skills, but good enough to clash like decently important skills. So I only have this up because it's only a decently clashing skill, and because of the unique synergy that has, which is only consuming Envy, there's some situations where this is actually pretty useful in very niche scenarios. I put this on yellow, not red, because that clashing is actually pretty damn useful, especially when it only costs 6 Envy and you can have a buttload of Envy during a fight. Next up, we have Fluid Sack Foss, the very infamous healing ego in Limbus. It was just amazing. What can I say? The only difficulty that you have in fueling this ego in bleed is the gloom requirement, and the gloom requirement is not going to be very you're not going to get gloom a lot until you have the 7th slot. Again, Arc Up Your Slot or Arc Up Ryoshu or Red Eyes Ryoshu with their S2 glooms. I'm talking about Arc Up Ryoshu and Arc Up Your Slot a lot, and one of the reasons I actually put them in my ideal teams is because of the synergies. I mentioned this earlier, the synergies, and now I'm mentioning the egos that are actually very useful for them. So now you can actually see the importance of having them as your 7th slot. Even though they might not look like the best bleed identities on the block, their synergies are more than enough to make it for it, because they give you access to very strong egos so much faster. So again, Fluid Sack Foss. The very infamous ego, heal all allies for 50% max HP, heal SP on heads hit, heal SP for all allies. But just amazing ego, what can I say about it? I put this on WoW for some reason. I don't think that's a WoW ego. I just realized I put the wrong tags on this on these egos. Hexnail is a Tef ego and Fluid Sack is a He ego, so I got that mixed up. So sorry for that, forgive me for that. But again, Fluid Sack, the very infamous 5/7 5 attack weight. Very easy to fuel, especially when you have your 7 slot with an S1 Gloom on each song, S2 Glooms on Red Eyes Ryoshu and Arkham Assault. Amplified even faster if one of your IDs die and you get a replacement of Arkham Assault or Red Eyes Ryoshu. You immediately have access to a lot of Gloom to fuel this. Very, very useful in a lot of situations. Highly recommend sharding it. Most new players are gonna have this. If you talk to any new player and you ask like what advice they got for like their first few days, like after the new manager, free season ID, free season 1 ID, and free ego thing, and you ask them what advice they got from other players, they would probably say, "Oh, I got told to shard in Corp Sinclair and Fluid Sack Foss." That's most players' experience, and they're totally right. A lot of players are gonna have Fluid Sack Foss, and Fluid Sack Foss is all the worthy of its attention. Very, very strong ego, amazing. Next up, for the final batch, the substitutes, the 7 slots, Red Eyes Ryoshu and Arkham Assault. I really like these IDs because they have access to extremely helpful egos, and one of the most important ego havers, at least in my opinion, like the most impactful ego haver in my opinion, is Red Eyes Ryoshu. Red Eyes Ryoshu has such good egos for bleed, it's insane. First of all, we have Force for the Flames Ryoshu, a ego that costs Wrath and Lust. Basically, it does give you 2 Fragile and that's it. 2 Fragile on a Lust skill is pretty helpful, especially when you are setting this up with God and Thorns Gregor. You can use this instead of your S3 if you don't have it fully ramped up. You can use this of your S3, and that's going to be very helpful for setting up even more with after you set up with your Gregor of Thorns, God and Thorns, Lust power up. You can have 2 Fragility, and that's just even more damage. What can I say? It's a very spammable ego with 2 Fragile, and it's decently rolling as well, and inflicts Burn. Which if you have a predetermined burn stack from Ring Isang plus 3 burn count, you can have like 6 burn potency and 2 burn count. Although that isn't too big, it's pretty okay, but not something you should focus on. The big thing is the fragile, and it's just pretty good. Next up we have Red Eyes Ryoshu. Yes, Red Eyes Ryoshu, the ego, not to be confused with Red Eyes Ryoshu, the identity. Red Eyes Ryoshu, the ego, closed in my opinion, is basically just an ego that all it does is it inflicts bind, and if the target already has bind, it inflicts 1 coin power down. Very useful for against enemies that have only 1 body part, and you can inflict blind consistently. This gets very, very useful after you set up your Ebony Stem Otis. After you set up your Ebony Stem Otis, this is going to be inflicting 1 coin power down every single time. Again, very useful for against single target bosses, mostly because of the 1 coin power down, especially against bosses with like 6 different skills. A certain boss in Kanto 8 does that, and because of the bonuses I mentioned earlier from Bind, it's very useful against that specific boss. Coin power down against like 5 skills, that's a lot of coin power down, and that's gonna allow you to win a lot of clashes and heal SP, and having basically an easier time inflicting bleed count and bleed potency and other things of that sort, and preventing damage. Overall, Red Eyes Closed Ryoshu is definitely useful. I wouldn't shard this personally, but if you do have it, it's a really nice bonus, and it's definitely going to come in handy against single target bosses where you're struggling. Some story bosses actually gain bind sometimes, so Red Eyes Ryoshu Closed actually is pretty useful for that. Some bosses like just gain bind naturally with their own effects. Again, read passive for bosses. Very useful. Just very, very useful in scenarios where it actually applies. And yeah, I wouldn't shard this personally again, but when you have it and when the time is right, it's definitely going to be very useful. Next up is Contemporary Ryoshu. Contemporary Ryoshu is, in my opinion, a very, very good ego for bleed. I actually would recommend sharding this if you have Red Eyes Ryoshu and you are at like Kanto 7, Kanto 8. I definitely recommend sharding this. This is a very important ego. Okay, so what it does basically is it inflicts 15 bleed split among a bunch of enemies, and we can ignore like the Gaze of Contempt stuff, but basically, if you have Lust Resonance, and you use this ego with it, and you have the Absolute Resonance, not even Absolute Resonance, I think it's just normal resonance of 6, you can get Gaze of Contempt, which increases the damage of this ego by 70% at 6 less resonance. At 5, you have 60%, etc., down. but at 6,000 rents, you gain 70% more damage to its ego, and at the end of the turn, you gain a lot of protection and aggro, so very useful for tanking sometimes, and especially since Realize Yoshu is a huge, really nice tank, the aggro isn't even that detrimental to her, especially when you gain 7 protection, it's not that huge anyway. I don't really focus on that. What I focus on, well, the damage is definitely good. Don't get me wrong, the damage and AoE is very, very good. But the most important thing about this ego, at least in my opinion, is that although, yeah, also it's very nice to be fueled by your bleed team. Bleed team def genuinely fuels this pretty well. You get this online like turn 5, turn 6. But what this ego does basically is it gives you synergies for a random affinity that this ID didn't use at that turn, and this is going to help you get a lot more synergies. I really like the passive collection of synergies, especially on an ID like Red Eyes Yoshu. So this ego just allows you to use other egos even more. But I'm focusing a lot on egos. I'm a player who has access to a lot of egos, and if you are a new player, it's not that important to have this ego for that specifically. It's definitely still a good ego for the effects that it does, but if you have egos, this ego becomes even more valuable. I personally really like this ego. I'm glad I got it when I was like gambling on my first 10 roll when this came out. It has proved to be extremely helpful, and this is actually an ego I would focus on fueling. After you get full SP, I actually immediately I think of, okay, I need to fuel either Sun Shower Isang for the SP heal. I either need to get Fluid Sac, or I either need to fuel Contempt Aryoshu and get it up and going. Like after one use of Contempt Aryoshu, your ego generation is just so much better. It's insane. I really like Contempt Aryoshu. Next up is Arc of Assault. Arc of Assault has, I mentioned earlier, very bad rolls, but with Regret Assault, it actually alleviates that a lot. You actually get very decent rolling skills if you have Regret Result. His S3 gains -1 base power in return for like +4 coin power at full conditionals, and that's very, very nice. In my opinion, Regret Result, you've already heard all about it. It's a very good ego. What more can I say about it? +2 coin power, -1 base power for all of Assault skills. Just very good. Next up is Pursuance Assault. Pursuance Assault is similar to Pursuance Rodion in that they use a lot of Sloth, but they basically heal your allies for a very high amount. I don't see myself using this ego too often, but I do like the heal that it does sometimes. It gets easier to get if you have Red Eye Contempt Aryoshu, and Contempt Aryoshu sometimes generates Sloth. And in those situations, the Sloth is actually very, very useful because you can actually use it for things like Pursuance, and Pursuance is very, very helpful for that. Pursuance overall is a very high rolling ego, very high rolling. I'd say like similar to Wayward Passenger as earlier, and it just heals. What more can I say about it? It also has a minor passive effect that gives you more attack power up if you attack power up or defense power up, if I remember correctly, if you win a clash with him. So just a pretty okay identity ego. I wouldn't use it every single fight. Sometimes it comes in handy. It actually came in handy for me in this one fight in Kanto 8, and I actually dealt the finishing blow with Pursuance Assault. So that's fun stuff right there. Next up is Uranium Mirror Column Assault. Uranium Mirror Column Assault is a free ego that you got from the Kanto 7 Battle Pass. If I remember correctly, it's the Season 4 one, I think. And basically, what it does is it activates Bleed a bunch, and the other effects don't really matter. There's a Rose Wedge and stuff like that, but those are minor. If you want to look them up, you can search it. But the most important thing about this ego and what it does is basically it activates Bleed a lot. And where this ego comes in handy is in late turns when you have a Bleed stack, you can actually use this ego to activate Bleed like 4 times. And when you have a Bleed stack up and going with like this team specifically, you have so much bleed count like already going up and running, and you're already maintaining it so much that it doesn't matter if you activate it 4 times. I don't really see myself using this ego too often. It's definitely useful in MD because you're able to stack bleeds so fast. But in story mode, you're really only going to be using this ego at like turn 7, turn 8, and that's so late into the fight. And it's more so just like accelerating the fight, at least in my opinion. It's definitely okay rolling, it's definitely an okay effect, but it's not that important to like use. It's definitely a good bonus if you have it from the previous season. I would not recommend charting it. I think there are better egos to chart other than this. So that's it for the ego discussion. I hope you've seen the power of egos in the Bleed team and how they're all relevant to Bleed. There sure is a couple of other egos that some people would want me to talk about, but at the very least, these are egos that I think, all these egos are those that I think are most relevant to Bleed and its playstyle in general. The last thing I want to talk about. Chapter 4, Barbara Otis. Barbara Otis is an ID that I've brought up sometimes in this video. And I think if you're a Barbara Otis supporter, you would realize, why am I running Ring Otis over Barbara Otis? And this section is dedicated to answering that question. So, without further ado, Barbara
카니발
Otis is, I feel, the most quote-unquote controversial thing about Bleed. By controversial, I mean like the most disgusting in terms of like, hey, what ID is better than what ID? A lot of things in Bleed is kind of set in stone now, considering the Blood Fiends that were released. Most Bleed teams that are consistent are running like the Blood Fiends plus Ring Sang, and then like plus 2 others, right? And it depends on like, oh, if you're trying to speed run, then you're running KKs because of Kirkbone Heathcliff, things like that. Actually, speaking of Kirkbone Heathcliff, I didn't mention him earlier, but I'll talk about it later. And a lot of things about Bleed is just like, oh, this ID is the best for Bleed, you're just gonna run this. And there's no really other ID that's as heavily debated on as Barbara Otis versus Ring Otis. I mean, since release, this identity was like immediately put into discussion. Is this ID better than Ring Otis? And people were discussing that. I myself believed at first that, oh, this identity seems to be better for Bleed. I like the fact that she actually has this over this. And after I feel an entire canto and months of playing Bleed, I felt that my mind had changed about this identity, and I ended up running Ring Otis. So to see why I made that decision, let's just look at her kit at first. So her stats are really similar to that of Manager Dawn. She has 3 stagger thresholds, she has low health, good speed, and just an okay defense level, blunt fatal, and her skills are Suing, Shizun, and I'll Make You a New Dress, a Gluttony, Lust, and Wrath. This is a pretty okay scenario PD spread. You have something akin to Priestgregor, but instead of the S3 being Lust, you have the S2 being Lust. This is the only Bloodfiend ID with S2 being Lust. So that already makes her the most consistent Lust generator in the team. But that's what you think at first, but I'll bring that up later. So her first skill is similar to other Bloodfiend skills. Similar to actually Manager Dawn's, she just consumes Blood Feast to gain her unique status, which if you don't know what it does, it gives offense level and defense level down unless you are at the max stage of it, which is stage 3, which is 20 and above, in which case you only get offense level, so it's just offense level mostly, and just more bleed infliction if I remember correctly. Not that important to talk about unless we're talking about the S3, which I'll talk about later. Her S2 is similar in that case, just consuming more in a more efficient way, being able to get up to 10, while her S1 is only able to get up to 5, with consuming 40 blood feast, and the S2 consuming 60 blood feast. So already we can see that the S2 is more effective in getting the status. And the S2, in which inflicts Suing Target. Suing Target is a status which is basically just conditionally one fragile, basically increased damage based on bleed on the target, which is maxed up to 10% if I remember correctly, which just means one fragile. So conditional one fragile, kind of ass if you ask me, but meh. So, and this Swing Target actually helps her inflict some more things. Her S1 has a conditional in which if the enemy has Swing Target, she inflicts +1 bleed count on her first and second coin, and her S1 be having 2 coins means that she's going to inflict +2 bleed count. This is the only source of bleed count she has on her kit. Her S, which is, underline that real quick, her S2 is just inflicting Swing Target, and if the target has Swing Target, she inflicts 2 bleed. Swing Target goes away directly at the next turn. So if you use this, you're going to lose out on the opportunity of using her S1 to inflict bleed count forever, because then the skills are going to be in rotation, right? So unless you are literally giving up opportunities to have more efficient blood feast consumption, then just to get like 3 of 3 S2s in a row just so you can get the S1 later, it's not really going to work out, because you are just delaying your own game plan for this identity, and that kind of means you're kind of not just doing anything, you're only using the S1, especially when your S1 is your S1 and S2 is all about building up to the S3. Her S3 is really not good without any build up, so you're kind of just sacrificing a lot of your damage and DPS just to have that situation where you want to inflict more bleed potency and then have the bleed count. You can't be that greedy on this identity. So speaking of like, oh hey, I'm setting up for my S3. Her S3 is the following. Her S3 basically is an attack skill that gains more attack weight depending on how much Blood-Tinged Scissor Blades you have, with a maximum attack weight of 3, and it has after kill effects which gives her more blood feast, and it regains half of Blood-Tinged Scissor Blades. Half, regain half, so this is already like looking at Manager Dawn stuff. Manager Dawn has a similar effect: after attack, gain hard blood, gain blood feast, and this is kind of like a quote-unquote inferior version of it, but at the very least the Manager Dawn one actually gives you 10 while this gives you half, so kind of like a trade-off of less blood feast but more selfish status for herself, and she gains coin power based on bleed, and that's kind of it. She does more damage on her last coin depending on the Blood-Tinged Scissor Blades she has. So when we saw the other Blood Fiend identities, what they are building up for their S3 is the following. Gregor, being the tank he is, uses the S3 to get even more tanky and heal back to full very easily, and his status for himself basically just increases that healing, and the effects don't really matter. So for Tick Gregor's case, his niche is being so tanky and cockroach-like. For Dulcinea, her niche is having AoE, similar to Barbara Otis, but her AoE also buffs allies. And it has better damage scaling in general because the damage scaling she has doesn't just apply on a single coin like Barbara Otis does, but applies on all of her coins because the conditional is placed like right on top of the text of everything, depending on the blood feast consumed. And finally, we have Manager Dawn, with her niche being a gigantic nuke, bleed activation, and AoE on her S2. Barbara Otis only has AoE that does damage. That's literally it about this identity. This identity has nothing else to go for it. I didn't really talk about Dulcinea. Okay, Dulcinea has the advantage of being such a fast ramping ID with chip healing and defense level up a little bit here and there, and having pretty good bleed count across her kit. This identity, Barbara Otis, doesn't have bleed count. It's really hard to get the S1 going unless you're just going unopposed, so you're just sacrificing SP on this identity. Like this, okay, well, I say SP on this identity, and then you're gonna say, oh, but Incorp Frost and Middle Salt. Well, yeah, but you're gonna get a lot less. Okay, well, I'll talk about that later actually. You're gonna get a lot less resonance because her last resonance is on skill 2. One important distinction about Barbara Otis versus Ring Otis is that Ring Otis has a S1 last skill, and Barbara Otis has a S2 last skill. And because Barbara Otis's niche isn't that special at all, in fact, she doesn't really have a niche. All she does is do bleed, and she doesn't really have a role. She is meant to be a DPS, but she lacks the DPS to really be consistent, at least in my opinion, especially in single target fights. And in general, she's only really that good in chain battles, because if you're in single target fights and your ID is all about getting AoE, and your AoE is all that is really special about your kit, it really doesn't feel good to run Barbara Otis. And one might already mention, oh, but Swing Target is a debuff, right? So it fully guarantees Anchor Frost. Okay, you're sacrificing +5 bleed count, S1 Lust, for a single conditional fragile that quote-unquote 100% procs your ring IDs. Do you know why 100% proccing ring IDs are so important? Because there's damn 2 of them. You're gonna get so much value because there's 2 of them. If you don't have a ring Otis in the first place, then you're just kind of enabling one ID, and that's kind of like, that's not enough justification for running a Swing Target, because although you're saying like, oh, it's gonna be more consistent with 100% guarantee, you're bringing down one of the IDs that are supposed to use that in the first place. So it's kind of just a net neutral. You can't really use that as an argument, especially when the status itself is just bad. Conditional 1 fragile? Are you kidding me? And although all her skills have okay coin power rolls like every single other ID, she just doesn't scale well, if you ask me. her S2 rolls a 19, her S1 rolls an 11, 11, 19, okay. And the whole point of his identity is about dealing damage, unlike Ring Otis, where you only want status infliction. This ID, although you want to win clashes and set up swing target, like, okay, the issue is you want to set up swing target and then you get conditionals on her S1, so you get more benefits and you consume it better. And the cycle is like, oh, S2 into S1, maybe just more S1s in between into an S2, etc., etc. The issue is that you are so like constricted by this that if you are out of cycle, this identity just feels so bad. Because once you don't have any S2s, your downtime on this identity feels so bad. Like using S1s like 2 turns in a row never feels good. You are consuming Blood Feast so bad, and you are just not inflicting anything. Like her S1 doesn't scale off anything. I mean, her S1 doesn't inflict anything. It's 2 bleed potency. She has no bleed count on her kit. And the thing about this identity is that you kind of want to win clashes to get SP more, right? Because this is a DPS ID. If this was a status focus ID, you don't really need to focus on getting SP, right? That's where Ring Otis comes in. She only wants to inflict statuses. She doesn't exactly want SP. This ID wants SP because she's a DPS. And you can't say she's not a DPS because her entire kit is based on dealing DPS. Her entire kit wants her to be a DPS. Her entire kit is not a status inflictor. If she was a status inflictor, she would have a better status instead of just swing target on her S2. She would have other things, but no, she's not a status inflictor. She is meant to be a DPS, and her DPS just feels terrible to use. You're just not getting anywhere with this identity. Like, and you're just consuming so much Blood Feast for what? I mentioned earlier, Dulcinea Rodion, she's consuming Blood Feast at combat start instead of like on use. Priest Gregory doesn't consume Blood Feast. Manager Dawn is the only one actively consuming Blood Feast. So if you saw my previous team lineup, you'd realize a lot of the Blood Feast really just lays on Manager Dawn, and this allows Manager Dawn to pop off really fast, right? And that's how you get really fast skill cycles. You're able to get to that 50 plus hard blood threshold, and you're able to cycle between your S1 and S2s. That's where the consistency comes in, right? When you run Barbara Otis, that consistency is thrown out the window. You don't have a single way of preventing her from not consuming Blood Feast. And before you mentioned her counter isn't even clashable. It's a normal counter. A normal counter on a fragile identity with 3 stagger thresholds. That's ridiculous. The only way you're gonna stop this identity from consuming Blood Feast is by using her counter, and her counter is not even clashable. Her counter is supposed to have her tank it. That's ridiculous. And the effect it has is +1 damn bleed count. Just ridiculous. Even Dulcinea Rodion, even though they only inflict +1 bleed count, the funny thing is, it has the first coin, if I remember correctly, the first coin inflicts bleed potency, and then the second coin inflicts bleed count. So if you actually started the bleed count, the bleed stack with Dulcinea Rodion, you're actually able to have +2 bleed count. But Barbara Otis literally only has 1 coin. It's worthless. This is worthless. Unless your enemy has multiple coins, only 1 coin on his skill, you're making them consume more bleed count than you're gonna be inflicting. It's negative, and you're harming your own identity. Also, I want to get back to my previous point, that she wants to win clashes. The thing about winning clashes, when you don't have a single source of bleed count, especially when it's so conditional, is that you're gonna be just consuming bleed count on them for no reason, and your bleed stack is gonna suffer because of that. This ID wants to win clashes to get SP faster so that she can deal damage, but while she is doing so, she is actively harming the stack. She is actively harming Blood Feast. She is actively harming the stack. And if you don't want her to actively harm Blood Feast, you are actively harming yourself. You are actively harming an ID on your team. I hope this really shows how awkward it is to use this identity. I'm definitely not saying her rolls are bad or anything. Her rolls are okay. The issue is, everything about her kit just is really awkward to use. Swing target is just so awkward to use. It's a bad status. It's her entire status, her entire skill cycle is so awkward to use. and when you're out of cycle, you're just not doing anything and actively harming your bleed stack and blood feast on top of that. So unless you're like saving your S2s until like turn 4, where you have like 3 S2s lined up, which is already so awkward, because that means you're already using her S1 so much to consume blood feast. It's so damn awkward. Like, unless you're doing that, and even then you're not doing anything for 4 turns. Whereas with Ring Otis, you'd have bleed count by now, you would have S1 Lust Resonance by now, you wouldn't need to save your S2s, which is, by the way, are Lust. So if you're saving them, you're having a harder time in activating your Lust Resonance skills. Your Lust Resonance for Kurokomo Ishmael, your Lust Resonance for Encore Cromer, you're having a harder time doing that. While Ring Otis is able to do that freely because her S1 isn't an important part of her kit, and in fact she doesn't even need to clash. She doesn't have any important part of her kit other than her S2, and that's what makes her so good. Her S2 has plus 5 bleed count. If you're running Ring Otis at that point, you would have like plus 10 bleed count value already then and there. Whereas Barbara Otis is actively just consuming your blood feast like a damn hog. And just to get into like us niche thing, yes, she is used in Railway. Yes, I understand that. I know she is used in Railway. I know she is used in Railway with Kurokumos. And I know my team isn't designed like that Railway team. The reason for that is consistency. That team needs so many stars to align. And Barbara Otis, you know why she's run there? Because it is a Railway. It is a Railway where you directly bring your other IDs directly into another fight. If you don't know the mechanics of the Railway, once you beat a fight, you immediately go to the next one. You don't have a loadout. You immediately go to the next one, sustaining all statuses and health you have in the previous fight. And that's why Barbara Otis is used there, because she actually makes her blood-tinged scissor blades stay. It is able to stay, and then you are able to save it for a key turn where you use the Barbara Otis to beat up 3 Pekatulums, which are really hard to beat, and Barbara Otis has the right nuke for that. If you were in any other situation where you aren't able to get that up and going, you are playing in a single fight, it's going to be a lot harder. You are consuming so much blood feast. By the way, this is on use. This is on use. On early turns, if your Barbara Otis is going first, guess what? You aren't consuming any blood feast because Manager Dawn wants to consume it first. So this ID just gets even more useless. Yes, you are gonna mention, but didn't you just say consuming blood feast is bad? Isn't that a good thing? Guess what? That's RNG reliant, and the thing is, if you aren't consuming blood feast, then that means you're still gonna consume blood feast if you're going slower. And guess what? Manager Dawn is a very fast identity, right? She has the hard blood fast things. She has the hard blood fast status. She gets 6 to 9 speed. Guess what? You're still gonna consume blood feast after that stage. Most of the time, Barbara Otis is still gonna suck up every single bit of blood feast. It's so damn hard to get things going when you have an ID that's just actively consuming blood feast for no apparent reason, for no apparent cash out. It's truly difficult. And even in situations where Manager Dawn is consuming hard blood first, when Manager Dawn is consuming blood feast later, the issue is like, okay, so what? The next turn she's probably gonna go slower, and then it's still gonna harm your bleed economy. And on those turns, that means you're still in your early turns. Your early turns, where Manager Dawn doesn't have her speed conditional and she's going last, then this ID isn't just gonna do anything. She really isn't gonna do anything. Sure, she's not consuming blood feast, but you're in your early turns. Your early turns are where you want to build your bleed stack, where you want to get chip bleed damage. You don't have a set blood feast bag yet. And the reason why my previous team I suggested is because all that blood feast is for Manager Dawn, right? It's for no other identity. No other identity really consumes it that much, and Dustin and Rodan consumes it at combat start, which has its own caveats, but you can play around it. Barbara Otis, you can't. It's RNG based. Every single time it's RNG based. And one or the other, you are playing your ID that's 1, not doing anything, 2, just gonna consume blood feast. So either way, this ID isn't gonna do anything. You're either not doing anything, actively consuming blood feast for nothing, and just harming your own blood feast in general. In fact, running this identity is bad for bleed count in the first place because of reasons I mentioned earlier with her wanting to clash and stuff. She's so awkward to play. Like, no matter how you play her, it's so awkward. But here's an argument that a lot. Actually, before we talk about that, I just realized I never talked about her passive. Her passive is tree less resonance, and she gets more damage based on the bleed on the target and blood feast consumed by self. By the way, she stacks herself for 30% more damage, and she's just so greedy. Sorry. What I was saying is, and what I want to say is, the thing is, what a prominent argument that people bring up to try to up Barbara Otis's potential as an ID, her usage as an ID, is that Manager Dawn, I mentioned earlier, she gains 2 hard blood whenever an ally takes bleed damage or consumes blood feast, and Barbara Otis sure does that. Hell yeah, she does. And she, well, gives you +2 hard blood for actively using her skills. So I mentioned earlier she's not doing anything. Well, guess what? She's giving +2 hard blood. Guess what? If you didn't run Barbara Otis in the first place, you would get hard blood faster. You wouldn't be running an ID that's just not doing anything. That 40 blood feast, that 60 blood feast, that 12 blood feast, that 16 blood feast that you're consuming for Barbara Otis, that could have went to Manager Dawn. And that could have been her source of hard blood instead of running this identity. There's no difference in hard blood generation. In fact, I think it's faster if you don't run Barbara Otis, in my experience, to get hard blood faster, because it makes no difference. 2 hard blood from this identity every single turn is the same as not running this identity because you're not consuming blood feast actively with this identity. It's the exact same thing. It's kind of like a bad argument in my opinion, and it's just not enough to solidify her position. And even if you argue like that, then what's the point of bringing this identity in the first place? You're just +2 hard blood, that's your justification? Really? After I just talked about everything about this kit, that's your justification? Ridiculous. The only places her justification is able to be allowed in is when in battles you have like 2-wave battles, 3-wave battles, like against sweepers. 3-wave battles where you're able to actually use her S3, and when that does happen, she's really good. Trust me, she is really good. I've played her in a lot of story content. I've played around with her, I've tested her in a lot of situations, and I will tell you, she excels in chain battles. But when you're in focus encounters with like only 1 wave, only 1 boss, she's just so awkward. She really is only good in chain battles that are really long, because then you'll be able to save her S3, and once you get her S3 going, then you have your game plan going, you have your scissor blades every single time, you don't have to consume as much blood feast to get that cap anymore, and you have your damage conditionals with her passive. It's great, but when you're in focus encounters where your entire goal is to try and make a bleed stack, she is actively detrimental. And the funny thing is about this identity, back then, because this identity is actually the first Blood Fiend to be released. Before Manager Dawn, before Priest Gregor, before Dulcinea and Rodion. Just a little bit of history, by the way. She was released after Ring Sang, so this is where Bleed was getting a lot stronger, along with Ring Otis. And immediately Ring Otis was contested with Barbara Otis. And people were experimenting and stuff. But the thing about this ID was that, oh, cool, she's a damage dealer. But the thing is, I don't have enough payout for it. I don't have enough support for it. Because her Blood Feast generation by herself isn't good. Notice her, if this unit failed to consume Blood Feast, conditionals, +2 bleed count on her S1. Don't fuck with me. That's horrible. That's just bad. Why? Because then you're just getting 2 blood feast. Amazing, you just got 2 blood feast. Congratulations, man. 2 damn blood feasts. That's great for you. It's so stupid. And before you get the idea, oh, but the unused conditional for getting 5 bleed on her S2. Oh, you can combine that with her S1. Dude! That means you haven't done anything for like the entire turn. Like, and all you're getting is like 6 bleed for that. It's her way of gaining bleed is so bad. You can't even get it properly. And her entire cycle is about using her S2 and then her S1 to get actual value for bleed, so then you can get blood feast. Well, you have this other route that's even worse than that awkward route already. Again, awkward usage. But again, back to what I was saying. When Priest character was released, again, I mentioned earlier, amazing engine, consuming a lot of, dealing a lot of bleed to himself, giving you a lot of blood feast, making the team extremely consistent. Sure, right? Okay, that's great. And this ID began to be run even more. Me personally, sharded this ID immediately. I ran her for the entirety of Canto 7. And with Bruce Gregor, I was frivolous. I was overjoyed. We have support for Blood Feast. She is now consistent. You can actually build it pretty consistently. Dulcinea Rodion comes in. Wow! You get even more support. Combat start, that doesn't really matter to the Blood Feast stack in the first place anyway. Wow! Her S3 is pretty damn good. Her cash out is pretty nice. Sure, she might have a gluttony counter so that you can't really run Anchor Chromer with it. But at the same time, you don't really want to run Anchor Chromer if you only have one ring ID anyway, so I didn't really run Anchor Chromer back then. But, back to what I was saying. Wow, this ID has even more support now, Dulcinea Rodion. She is a stacking identity, giving buffs to Blood Fiends. Guess what? You know, I mentioned earlier her 2 attack power up. Barbara Otis back then was the lowest HP ally that you had on your team. Previously, Manager Dawn, I think were like 170, 180-ish, HP 176, if I remember correctly, exactly. Barbara Otis has 196. She is the second lowest HP Blood Fiend. And back then, before Manager Dawn was even released, she was the one getting the 2 attack power up. So if you can't tell already, by the way, her stats are very similar to Manager Dawn. She is just like a cheaper Manager Dawn. She is Manager Dawn, literally, before Manager Dawn was released. And guess what? She was amazing! Literally, she was really, really good. I really enjoyed running her. And then Manager Dawn released. And after a few weeks of people trying Manager Dawn, people realized, well, at least some people realized, with how Blood Feast heavy Manager Dawn is, and how good she is with that consumption of Blood Feast, it's really awkward to have another ID that wants to consume Blood Feast at like a very similar rate, while having a generally worse payoff, worse niches, and a worse cash out. Overall, her entire kit is just worse than Manager Dawn, and all those caveats I mentioned earlier, with her consuming Blood Feast so much, and her just having a very awkward skill cycle, and her not providing anything to the team other than just damage dealing capabilities, which Manager Dawn, Ring Isang already has. Running this ID just becomes actively detrimental. Your cash out on this identity is just bad. And that's the reality of this identity. And it's so much easier to get a bleed stack up and going if you don't run this identity. If you're just going unopposed on this identity to like prevent the caveats I mentioned earlier with like, oh, right, you're not gonna need to, you don't have to waste their blood stacks, bleed stacks. You are able to just eat it freely, you're able to deal damage freely. Oh, guess what? I'm gonna get SP later anyway with Anchor Chromer. You know what Ring Otis would have done by then? I mentioned this earlier already. She would have done +5 bleed count at some point already because of nails. And with Ring Sang's help with it. She would have done something already, instead of like Barbara Otis, which is just standing around with a bad cash out doing nothing. Sure, she's going towards it, but she's doing nothing in the meanwhile. It's ridiculous. Like, she has situations where she excels. I mentioned this already. She has a situation where she excels. Railway speed runs, long chain battles. In any other situation, Ring Otis is just better. In these non-specialized conditions, Ring Otis is just better. Not only because you're able to get a bleed stack a lot more consistently with +5 bleed count on an S2, which is so much more consistent than this abomination. So much more consistency. You're able to get a bleed stack up and going whenever you want. Ring Otis having that +5 bleed count is so strong for bleed. It's amazing. It's so damn strong. And you don't have any of the caveats that Ring Otis has. I mean, sorry, that Barber Otis has, because for Ring Otis, you don't care about clashes or anything. I really hope this really highlighted, like Barber Otis in general. Like, people realize after Manager Dawn released that this idea is just not really gonna work out. And some people are still running Barber Otis to this day. And I understand if you're running her for her appearance. She has an amazing design. I understand that completely. I definitely want to run her for that. Other than in situations like Railway MD, very important thing. MD, Barber Otis is better in MD than Ring Otis, because in MD, bleed count doesn't matter. You have blood feast everywhere. It doesn't matter at all. Ring Otis doesn't matter in MD because she has bad rolls and she only has bleed count. In story mode, Ring Otis is better and Barber Otis is worse, but in MD, Barber Otis is definitely better. That is a really quick thing I want to get out there. So just quick out there, yes, there is a use for Barber Otis, and that is an MD. But it's so unfortunate that you're not able to use this cool ass design, because she's just sorry, she is just not good. Like, Barber Otis believers can say whatever they want, she is just not good for bleed. In my like 1 year-ish of playing bleed, like just testing out this identity, switching back and forth between, oh, Ring Otis seems better, oh, Barber Otis seems better, oh, Ring Otis seems better, oh, Barber Otis seems better, switching back and forth. In my experience, I will tell you wholeheartedly, I don't think Barber Otis is good. And that's it for the ramble. That's it for the rant. That's literally it about Barber Otis. I hope you enjoyed listening to all that. Funny story that I want to give out before I end this section is, you know, the PM Discord. I was like going on there and I was like, hey guys, dude, Barbara Otis, I think she's actually better for bleed, because she gives +2 hard blood for Manager Dawn, so it's just net neutral, right? And Manager Dawn doesn't really exactly get like stopped by it. It's actually pretty neutral. You can actually run Barbara Otis, and she's a pretty good identity. She's a definite DPS. She's like top 3 in the DPS charts. Some random guy comes up and he's like, dude, Ring Otis is better. And we had an argument, and turns out I lost. I didn't really push it that much. He called me some insults. Great. Okay, so I just went on with my life. And then I tested out Ring Otis later. And then I came back to the Discord a few months later going, dude, I don't get why people run Barbara Otis. I feel like Ring Otis is just better. And I tried to give all the same arguments I had in this section, and I got shit on. No, Barbara Otis is better. I hope that highlights like how split the community is about Barbara Otis and Ring Otis. And that really fucking annoyed me, by the way. But that really highlights like how split the community is on Barbara Otis versus Ring Otis. Ignoring the players who just run Barbara Otis because she looks cool. I mean, hey, based. I mean, good for him. But this is just my perspective on the whole thing. Hey, if you want to run Barbara Otis, up to you, man. I'm just giving my own reasons as to why I don't run her personally on my bleed team, and why I don't find her to be good. And you can play any team you want. This is just personally my opinion. This entire video is my own opinion. You can have your own opinions. I'll be glad to hear them out. But this is just my reasoning as to why I don't like running Barbara Otis in my bleed team. So, we've reached around the end of the slide. This is chapter 5, my closing thoughts. Here we have the whole bleed gang gathered up. One thing I want to mention before I actually finish this video is the release of Fell Bullet Isang. I looked at his kit. I don't see him to be a core necessity for bleed. He seems to be a very niche ID. And speaking of niche ID, I actually saw a strategy where you run the Kurokumos and you kill the Kurokumos using Fell Bullet Isang and Fell Bullet Isang the Ego. And you have this whole speedrun energy focused around that for the Kurokumo IDs. Very cool stuff. But again, specialized situations, and I don't recommend that for consistency. Also, I actually realized I didn't talk about Kurokomo Heathcliff at all. The reason I don't think Kurokomo Heathcliff is good in Bleed is because Kurokomo Ishmael is better on the bench, and if Kurokomo Ishmael is on the bench, why bother running Kurokomo Heathcliff? That is a very short explanation for it. If you want to know the details, just look at his kit, and you'll understand why. And you can look at other people's opinions. Running Kurokomo Heathcliff without Kurokomo Ishmael really brings down a lot of his potential. So just very short thing I want to get out there because I completely forgot to talk about it. I should have talked about it in the substitutes, in the team loadout section. Forgive me for that. But onwards with my closing thoughts on this video. Number one, the few things to take from this video, just finishing thoughts, the pure lessons you want to take from this like 2-hour video, I believe, is number one, Bleed is really damn expensive. You have so many 000 identities, and yeah, I guess you have Ring Otis, but because Bleed is so specialized and the IDs are so set in stone, and if you don't have like a single ID, your entire like thing might be like ruined. Like if you have all the Blood Fiends, but you don't have Priest Gregor, guess what? You lose so much consistency. If you have all the Blood Fiends except Manager Dawn, guess what? You are losing out on a really strong DPS character. If you have all the IDs except Ring, you just lost another DPS character. If you have all the IDs except Dulcinea Rodion, well, Dulcinea Rodion isn't actually that. Yeah, actually, not having Dulcinea Rodion is actually perfectly fine, honestly. You can run another ID over Dulcinea Rodion. The issue is you're not going to be able to ramping your Magic Dawn as much, and you don't have the 2 attack power up anymore, and you don't have the good Sydney FPDs anymore, so that's what Dulcinea has over everything else, but other than that, she's kind of quote-unquote replaceable. But anyways, Bleed is really damn expensive, and IDs in this status especially is really like not really non-negotiable. Like unlike Burn, right? You have a lot of like filler IDs in Burn. Like you have Liu Ryoshu, you can run Liu Salt, goddammit. Like you have very forgiving stuff. Bleed, you can run like cheaper, badder IDs like Pekot Heathcliff if you have her from Gacha. If you have him from Gacha, Hook Hong Lu, Captain Ahab, the Kurokumos, Ting Tang. You can have these guys, but you can't deny the fact that if you don't have the correct Bleed identities, you're just losing out on so much potential on the status, and this status just doesn't work as well. So that's one thing you have to learn, is that Bleed is really expensive. I do not recommend it for a beginner until the next season. Why? Because you cannot chart Kanto 7 IDs at the moment. You're gonna have to wait until Kanto 9, season 6, if I remember correctly, season 7. I really don't remember, but you're gonna have to wait until next season so they can chart the IDs if you even want to have a chance of playing Bleed, because as of now, Bleed is a horrible status to focus on. Please do not go for Bleed. If you're a new player watching this video, do not go Bleed. Just go for any other status. I recommend Sinking if you just started out the season. As of right now, it is pretty early into the season. The Kanto just got done. We have like a few more months until next season. I highly recommend Sinking because you're able to get a lot of shards for Sinking, and Walhalla and Heathcliff, a very strong identity that you might want to shard. Very easy. It's going to help you cruise through the entirety of a lot of the Kantos. And Sinking is a very solid status to work with anyway, especially when all the IDs are shardable already through the Kanto 6 sharding place for your dispense. Second thing, Last Resistance is key. 4 Last Resistance is the most important thing in your first 4 to 5 turns. That is going to help all your IDs get SP. That is going to make everything consistent. That is going to help your Kurokomo Ishmael passive be activated. That's going to help you have Bleed count. Very, very important. The consistency is what makes Bleed strong. No other status has the same level of consistency of Bleed. Sure, you might argue, Sinking. They make them have less SP, and therefore it's kind of a similar effect, right? Well, yes, but at the same time, you're gonna lose to base clashes because you also have quite low SP. Unless you're an MD, that status really gets to really high SPs really fast. But outside of MD, Sinking doesn't have the same consistency as to Bleed. I'm sorry about this, but I don't know any other statuses like Rupture, Tremor, Burn. I mean, Burn is really consistent, yeah, but I believe that Bleed is like the most consistent status out of all the other statuses. You can crucify me for that take, definitely, because I have no experience in other statuses. I am a Bleed one trick. Underline, I am a Bleed one trick. I don't know any other status. I know Sinking. I have a Sinking team. I know Burn. Any other status, I'm sorry if I dissed you, but I do feel that bleed is the most consistent status in my perspective. But I do lack a lot of background about other statuses. Third thing is, your bleed stack is important. So many people think that because of the blood fiends, oh, you just get bonuses off of the things they have, so you don't really need to focus on bleed stack, because then you get the chip bleed, and you get the blood feast, and you get access to really strong skills. All your IDs scale really well with bleed, and bleed is just as important because all your IDs like really scale hard off of bleed, and if you have bleed, you're consistently having blood feast even more than just a chip. So bleed stack is really important. Again, solidifying the importance of the 4 lost resonance for Kurokoma Ishmael passive activation and SP heal and consistency. Again, solidifying Info Chromers, 100% activation for your ring IDs for bleed count. All of that playing into this. Number 4, know what your next ego is. Plan it. I notice so many people really ignore egos and they only kind of like, oh, this ego is active right now, I should use it. Well, the thing is, you should really focus on like my voice is getting hoarse. You should really focus on like what ego you want to use next. In Bleed especially, some really key egos you want to talk about is Chains of Others Mere Salt, Sunshower Isang, Contempt All Ryoshu, Ledger Domain at some points. These kinds of egos, Rosé Desire Rodion, yes, Rosé Desire Rodion, Red Ribbons Rodion, very important egos that you want to build towards. And I see so many people like just not caring about ego synergies that much. Well, the thing is, for Bleed, it's really important because, again, Red Ribbons Rodion, the best Bleed ego in my opinion, because it literally allows you to have a Bleed stack turn 4 completely free and have tons of free damage, and you're able to like just have that last until next turn. That's a really key ego, and what I don't see people doing is like, oh, I need to plan for this ego, I need to use this as Infinity. In some situations, you want to give up the 4 lost resonance in return for the Sin Infinities. One example of this I had was, you have to adapt with this team, right? One situation where I used this strategy in was in a certain mid-boss, a sit mid-boss in part 3 of Canto 8, where the enemy has bind debuffs. If this unit has bind, gain X, and the boss was single target and he had a lot of coins. So my strategy for the fight was that I would focus on completely fueling Chains of Others every single turn, and the 4 last resonance is put as like a second priority. So every single turn where I'm not able to get 4 last resonance, I completely focus on getting the resources needed for Chains of Others, and I give up using better skills, quote unquote better skills, over other ones just because of the Sin Infinity. You need to plan for stuff like this and you need to adapt to it. Another example, you have a bleed stack, you have a lot of nuke coming up, but you're not sure if your bleed stack can stay. So instead of using it all on that turn, you wait another turn and you focus on fueling Red Ribbons Rodion. Or you nuke them that turn, they have like 11 and 1 bleed stack, 11 and 1 bleed count, 11 potency and 1 bleed count, and you focused on fueling Sin Infinities the last turn. Guess what? Now you have access to Red Ribbons Rodion, and that bleed stack completely stays for that turn. Good for you! Egos are really important to plan. I feel like this is really important for every single team out there. This is just a general tip for you guys in Limbus. Plan your egos. Your egos are really important. Next thing I want to talk about, which already played into a previous point, adapt if you have the right resources. Right resources as in if you have the right egos, you have the right IDs, then you're able to play adaptive. Again, Red Ribbons Rodion is a Walbert Gisnot ego playing into number 1 there. Bleed is quite expensive. You have to roll in Walbert Gisnot, you have to shard in Walbert Gisnot. It's a very limited exclusive team. And once you have all the right resources, like I do, then you're able to like really have the bleed varieties of strategies that you can use. Like the Arc Corp Salt, replacing Realize Yoshi depending on the team, Chains of Others, planning your egos, that kind of stuff. That adaptability is only accessed when you have the right resources. So yeah. Number 6, very strong single enemy bosses. I have mentioned this so many times over the course of this video. This status is so strong against single enemy bosses. Some highlights: Kurokoma Ishmael buffing up Ring Isang's S2, inflicting +6 bleed count on a single target. Ring Otis inflicting +5 bleed count on a single target. Magic Dawn inflicting +4 bleed count on a single target. and the other I think is just having a really good bleed count in general. So yeah, and Encore Comer being really focused on flicking statuses on one person, and still you have the AoE from Manager Dawn. So all this, unlike other statuses where you don't really care that much unless you're like sinking, like Burn, it doesn't really care, right? I mean, Tremor, sure, Rupture to some extent, but no other status really benefits like off of having like such accessible bleed on an enemy as bleed does, because bleed opens so many things like blood feast into skill cycles, and then you can have your cycles complete. You can have your Manager Dawn cycling between S1, S2, S3 every single time at 15 plus hard blood permanently. No other status that has that amount of like payoff for like having a very accessible way to inflict statuses and capitalizing on that status. Like other statuses just like nuke them. Bleed gains so many things, it's ridiculous. You gain so many blood feasts, you're able to stabilize for the rest of the turns, you're just chilling. And blood feast is like one of the strongest scaling things in Limbus, at least in my opinion, other than like Arcor Ponglu and charge, potency, stacking. This is the next best thing in scaling for Limbus. Next, remember to count your bleed procs. Count your bleed procs. This is a really hard thing to do, but I really recommend just counting the coins they have. Realizing what you clash matters a lot in your bleed stack. Like if you're clashing a skill that has 2 coins, know that that's going to consume 2 bleed count, and that's going to affect later turns, etc. Make sure your bleed count, when it is fully ramped, doesn't fully go out if possible. Truly, I've had a lot of blunders on this, and that has costed me fights. Literally, that has costed me fights. Bleed stack is important, and if you lose that because of a mistake you make, it sucks. But you just have to learn. So that's it for the takeaway points. And my future thoughts for the bleed now. My future thoughts for bleed are very, very hopeful. If you don't know what I mean by that, a certain Latvian from a certain intervalo that I really, really like and I'm looking forward to. Please be careful for Sinclair. I'm really, really looking forward to this very, very specific identity that I hope is going to be very good for Bleed. So I have very high hopes for Bleed soon because of the up and coming, most likely Bleed identity that's going to come up later. If he doesn't come out, please hang me! Anyways, and I hope he's pretty good. So that's just my future thoughts on Bleed. Not really a lot of other future thoughts. I feel like Bleed is really set in stone. Unless they like revolutionize Bleed again, like in another way other than Blood Feast, like another way similar to Blood Feast, sorry. I don't really see Bleed changing that much because the Blood Fiends are so damn strong, so you really have only like 3 or 2 slots to like really change the meta of for Bleed. Like Ringy Sang and and the 3 Blood Fiends really already solidified their position, so I really find it hard to believe that like the 2 other slots, I mean 3 other slots now because of the 7 Sinner max in other cantos now, I really find it hard to believe that they're gonna have like better IDs. Like sure, I guess there might be an ID that is better than Radius Leadership, maybe there's an ID that's better than Mirror Salt. But then, unless that happens, I really don't see Bleed having like huge revolutionized mechanics. We'll see in like 2 or 1 year. Prove me wrong. I can't wait to see it because I will still be playing Bleed and I'll still be playing Limbus. And another thing I'm hoping for, well, I'm not really looking forward too much. Cassetti, sorry, okay, I just spoiled it. Okay, whatever. Cassetti, the idea I'm looking forward to is just in an intervalo. And this season was Rupture based, next season is Burn based. I don't believe Mir Salt's Kanto is going to be Bleed based at all. If anything, I think he would be a Tremor based season. So far, Bleed doesn't look like it's going to get a lot of content. And the only content Bleed's probably going to get is like in years to come. I don't think we're going to have a Bleed focused season anymore because season's content 7 was such a big Bleed up boost that I don't think there's going to be another Bleed season. I think Bleed is going to be in like small updates like intervalos and things like that. And since the next season is Burn, hey, you Burn players, go ahead and build Burn like right now. Another team I recommend building, I recommend building Burn. People are gonna say to me, Warburg is not. So many good Burn ideas are locked outside of it. Burn is completely fine. just know, yes, it's really hard to get Burn up and going, but if you have the resources, please build Burn right now. This is the perfect time to invest in Burn. Literally, this is the perfect time to invest in Burn. You guys had no idea how hard I had it before Kanto 7 and Rengi-san. Investing in Bleed was so damn risky, but it paid out in the end. But Burn, you guys, you have a really good team already. LCE Faust, MB Otis, Philip Claire, you guys are so damn privileged that you guys don't even know. And this is the perfect time to invest because you're gonna have a really good Burn season next season. So, I'm really looking forward to Yoshi's Kanto, and I'm glad, I'm really happy with how this season turned out. The Kanto was amazing. I really enjoyed it with my Bleed team. I beat it pre-nerf, just a small flex right there. I beat it pre-nerf purely with my own Bleed team, my Bleed team that I mentioned earlier, with that full exact same loadout. And that is a PowerPoint about Bleed finished. Thank you for staying in this entire video with me, and thank you for watching this whole thing with me and listening to me ramble about Bleed. Yes, that is the definitive, well, not definitive, that is my interpretation of Bleed from a player that really, really loves Bleed. Thanks for watching.